People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GBNews. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
And a very warm welcome to GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst. Coming up for you today, yes, it's Prime Minister's Questions, live from the House of Commons, ahead, of course, a tumultuous day in Westminster. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to face Labour leader Keir Starmer once more, but ahead then of a parliamentary vote on the Windsor Framework on Northern Ireland, and then a certain Boris Johnson will be appearing at the Privileges Committee to defend claims he intentionally misled MPs over Partygate. And just to add to the drama, Mr Johnson announced that he will join Liz Truss in voting against the Prime Minister's Northern Ireland deal. Well, we're joined in the studio by our own parliamentary committee, well, 2 MPs anyway, Labour member for Chesterfield and Shadow Education Minister Toby Perkins, and Conservative MP for Bury North James Daly, True Blue Red Wall MP. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for being with us on this particular day, because we are obviously going to update you with what's going to be happening in Prime Minister's Questions. But first, just to update everyone with what the ERG have been saying, strongly recommending that the MPs vote against the Windsor Framework, although we've got Steve Baker then earlier basically saying if Boris Johnson decides to go down that route, he'll be risk becoming a pound shop Nigel Farage. Blimey.
I'll be supporting the government today. I think the Windsor Framework is a positive step. The ERG certainly saved their recommendations to the last minute. Yeah. So in respect of that. But
although I think Mark Francois indicated that his personal view was to vote against.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should respect colleagues. Colleagues will have deeply held views in respect to this. I think the Prime Minister has negotiated a better deal for the people of Northern Ireland. I think it has, although I fully appreciate the concerns the DUP have, it has support in Northern Ireland. The Ulster Unionist support party are backing the deal. And I think we should all get behind it.
And did the ERG have to go down that route because they'd indicated they would follow the DUP's lead?
I'm not in the ERG. I suspect there may well have been some of that because there are close links between the DUP and the ERG.
Next key question, how many do we think are in the ERG or will join Boris Johnson and Liz Truss in voting against this? I mean, Steve Baker says he doesn't think the government has to rely on opposition MPs to win the vote.
I genuinely don't know, Mark, but can I just make this very brief point? One of the greatest men I've met in Parliament, who's not, I should say, a household name as an MP, has spent days really concerned about this, really worrying about this. So this is not a subject that is a matter of it's a matter of real concern to a lot of Conservative MPs with deeply held views. So I don't know the numbers, but I don't think we should look at this in the sense of people rebelling against the government. It is something that is absolutely imprinted on what they feel is about the union and about being in the Conservative Party.
Toby, does Keir Starmer have to do much today? Just sit back and let it all happen?
Well, I think there is an element of that. I think, once again, we're seeing that the Conservative Party is just completely unleadable, and that's why there is such a public demand for a general election. This is a government that's just run out of road. They've reached that point where they're simply unable to function. And luckily, for the sake of the country, Labour MPs will step forward and will vote alongside James, and that deal's going to go through what the ERG think or not.
Right, but what about Steve Baker's very important point? He thinks the numbers indicate that the government won't have to rely on opposition votes to get this through, that there are enough Tories who see the positive points in this.
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen. I mean, it will be a symbolic victory for Rishi Sunak if he's able to actually get something through without having to rely on the Labour Party. In functional terms, it's going to go through anyway because Keir Starmer's made it clear that we'll support it. But, the power that this sort of knot of Conservative MPs have had, has brought Theresa May down. It made Boris Johnson's life a misery. Liz Truss never really got much of a chance because of her own frailties, and now we're on to the fourth leader, or fifth if you include Cameron, who's having to dance to their tune. And
and one, on a parliamentary note, James, it's interesting. Not one but two former prime ministers now declaring how they're going to vote ahead of the vote. I mean, there was a time when a former prime minister kept their counsel, not purder as such, but letting MPs to go their own way.
Well, I think it's very interesting when you look at the deals that those prime ministers actually supported in the past. And I think this deal is a great improvement on what they negotiated.
Yes.
So I am somewhat astounded by the stance of two of my colleagues who...
is it sour grapes by both of them?
I don't know what it is, but I remember one Prime Minister in particular telling me in 2019 that the withdrawal agreement was an excellent agreement and that I should be backing it as part of the wider package of getting Brexit done. That doesn't seem to have been correct advice I received at the time.
Yeah, OK. Well, we'll see what the votes are going to be later, because we've got, obviously, the Privileges Committee sitting at 2 o'clock to hear Boris Johnson's evidence. We understand that will break to allow the MPs and Boris Johnson himself to go and vote on the Windsor framework. What are you expecting in terms of that Privileges Committee? It's not a court of law, it's not a legal... where you have to prove your innocence beyond reasonable doubt. Do you think he's going to get away with it today?
Well, I don't know about that. I think that the evidence is there. I absolutely respect the people who are on that committee, and I believe that they will...
leading, of course.
I'm leading, but with a Tory majority. But I do think that people have been put under appalling pressure, those Conservative MPs, being effectively threatened with deselection if they don't come to a certain conclusion. You couldn't imagine someone going to be a juror and get told, if you don't come to the right conclusion, we're going to take your house off you or whatever.
Rishi Sunak has indicated to all Tory MPs they will have a free vote to decide on whatever the committee comes up with.
Well, exactly, and I think that, it's the wrong approach. This is a committee that is there to investigate the evidence dispassionately and tell us what it finds. And if they come to that conclusion and then get overridden by MPs who haven't been on that committee, I think that would be wrong. But let's see what happens today.
OK. James, I think I'm right in saying your majority was 105 votes, the most marginal seat in England, on that red wall return.
Yes.
And I assume you think maybe the Boris Johnson factor was part and parcel of being returned with that?
I think there were lots of things at the time. I think the Jeremy Corbyn factor was a big factor. Yeah. I think getting Brexit done and people wanting an end to that debate and what had gone on for a number of years, and people wanted change. And it was throughout the north of England, so it was a number of things.
But it's an existential question, isn't it, for the Tory party? Not just the issue of Partygate itself, but what happens to Johnson now and his political future. And it could well be that comes to a stop if the committee decides basically to sanction him.
Well, I think it's a process exercise. I think the committee will come to whatever conclusion they want to come to. That will be put in front of MPs. MPs are given a vote for a reason. That's the process that Parliament has set down. But Boris Johnson's not the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson is a backbench MP who is giving evidence, as is his right, about something that happened when he was in office. But what that's got to do with how the government is functioning with the major issues that we're tackling is two separate things. We've completely moved on from that.
Yeah. OK. And what is your own take on what you've heard so far? Because obviously he's released, I think it was 52 pages. We've now got 110 pages from the committee themselves. So quite what else we're going to hear in the committee itself. I mean, have you come to a judgment yourself?
Listen, Mark, before I came in here, I was a criminal lawyer. And I like to hear the evidence before making a pronouncement or a decision. As Toby's quite rightly said, the committee is going through all of the evidence. It'll be very... we'll see what their conclusions are, and that's the way...
Although it's not a judicial, even a quasi-judicial setting, it's a parliamentary setting, is it? So...
Yeah, but it's been set up, the process is set up to allow individual MPs to defend their position with evidence and to give evidence, and I think that's a good thing.
And in front of the cameras, in not open court, but in open committee session. And we'll have the pictures, of course, on that. So, I mean, PMQs, bit of a B feature, isn't it, coming up? And what do you think Keir Starmer will use as his line of attack? Because he was very strong yesterday, of course, on the whole issue of the Met Police and the way that he said that the government mishandled crime and dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll wait and see what he's going to say, but I think you're right. He's got a number of different opportunities as to what to go on. I think he has been very clear that because of his background, law and order and crime's a real priority to him. But we'll wait and see what it is he wants to pose to the Prime Minister. I think you're right. It might not be the number one item on the news at the end of today, but nonetheless, it's an important opportunity for Leader of the Opposition to hold the government to account.
Yeah, and he does have this habit of coming in at oblique angles with something that wouldn't necessarily be the sort of the headline of the day. So, I mean...
Well, sometimes, I mean, I think, you look at one time, the whole Partygate thing was seen as an oblique angle. It didn't end up too badly for him, did it? So, I think...
Go on that again, will he?
I don't know. We'll wait and see. I'm not suggesting that he will.
No, I mean,
I'm simply saying that, there was a time when people were saying, oh, why is he going on that again? And he was, I think, ultimately proven right.
Yeah, well, so Lindsay Holt, Speaker, on his feet. So let's just head over to the Commons now for PMQs.
TV. We start with questions to Prime Minister Joe Gideon.
Question one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow is the National Day of Reflection, a Marie Curie-led initiative bringing together communities across the UK to remember family, friends, neighbours and colleagues we have lost. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking Stoke City Council for supporting my call for a postbox to heaven in Carmountside Cemetery, and on the second anniversary of the tragic death of my constituent, 2-year-old Harper Lee Fanthorpe, who swallowed a button battery, will he thank her courageous mother, Stacey, for leading the campaign to raise awareness of the dangers of button batteries? And will he back my call for legislation to ensure greater product safety?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course I join my honourable friend in thanking Stoke City Council. I'm very sorry to hear of Harper Lee's tragic case, and my thoughts are with her friends and family, and particularly her mother Stacey. And we are aware of the concerns about button batteries. The law is very clear that products available in the UK must be safe. The Office for Product and Safety Standards has published guidance on exactly this for manufacturers and is working with the Child Accident Prevention Trust to educate parents and childcare professionals on button baton safety.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we remember the innocent lives lost 6 years ago in a terror attack on Westminster Bridge. Amongst those tragically killed was PC Keith Palmer, who sacrificed his life to protect others. police officers up and down the country work tirelessly every day to keep us safe, and we thank them for that. But as we saw this week, those brave officers are being let down. Dame Louise Casey found institutional homophobia, misogyny and racism in the Metropolitan Police. I accept those findings in full. Does the Prime Minister?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I join with the honourable gentleman paying tribute to PC Palmer and indeed all the other police officers who have lost their lives serving and those who do so much to keep us safe. I was appalled, Mr. Speaker, to read the descriptions of the abhorrent cases of officers who have betrayed the public's trust and abused their powers. And let me be clear, it is and was unacceptable and should never have happened. We have taken a series of steps already, and the government will also now work with the Mayor and the Metropolitan Commissioner to ensure that culture, standards and behaviour all improve. At the heart of this matter are the people whose lives have been ruined by what has happened, and I know the whole House will agree with me that it is imperative that the Met works hard to regain the trust of the people it is privileged to serve.
Keir Starmer.
I take it from that answer that the Prime Minister does accept the Casey findings in full, including the institutional failures. Because nobody reading the Casey report can be left in any doubt about how serious this is, and doubt for a second that it's restricted to the Met. The report lays bare how those unfit to join the police are aided by patchwork vetting systems that leave the door open. If the government backed Labour's plan for proper mandatory national vetting, we could end the farce that sees different police recruitment standards in different forces. Will he back that plan so we can make speedy progress?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there's no need to back that plan because we're already taking action to tackle the issues that are raised in the Casey report. And it was actually 2 months ago. It was 2 months ago that I met with Dame Louise Casey and the Metropolitan Commissioner, and we introduced a series of measures. For instance, the College of Policing is currently updating the statutory code of practice for police officer vetting that all forces legally have to follow. All police forces are in the process of checking their officers against the Police National Database, and in weeks, Her Majesty's Independent Inspectorate will report back on their re-inspection of all forces vetting procedures. Now, these steps, of course, won't undo the terrible damage that have been previously committed, but we owe this action and more to the victims and survivors to ensure that such tragedies never happen again.
Well, the problem with the Prime Minister's answer is what he's referring to isn't mandatory. How can it possibly be right to have different standards for recruitment in different police forces? No wonder the Casey report criticised what she calls the government's hands-off attitude to policing over the last 13 years. But let's call it what it really is: sheer negligence. The report also exposes chronic failures by the police to deal with rape cases, with officers using, and I quote, overstuffed or broken fridges containing the rape kits of victims. On his watch, rape charges are 1.6%. Yet the government still hasn't backed Labour's plan to have proper, high-quality rape and serious sexual offences units in every police force. Why not?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what Louise Casey also says is that primary public accountability of the Met sits with the Mayor of London. She described that relationship between the Mayor and the Met as, in her words, dysfunctional. But when it comes... So I hope when he stands up, he will also confirm to the House that he will take up these matters with the Labour Mayor of London so that he plays his part. But Mr. Speaker, the way rape victims were treated by the criminal justice system wasn't good enough, and that's why the government published an ambitious rape review action plan. It's right that we've extended Operation Sorteria across all police forces in the country. We've tripled the number of independent sexual violence advisors. We've improved the process of collecting phone evidence and being cross-examined. And since 2010, we've quadrupled funding for victim support services. That is a Conservative government doing everything we can to support victims and tackle predators.
People are fed up to the back teeth with a government that never takes responsibility and just tries to blame everyone. They can shout if they're proud of the fact that over 98% of rapists are never put before. If they want to shout about that, that's their record. Let them shout about it. You should be ashamed of yourself. The truth is simple. After 13 years of Tory government, crime is out of control and people are paying the price. Before Christmas, the BBC reported the shocking case of a woman in Armthorpe who'd been beaten with a baseball bat by burglars 3 years ago. Nobody had been charged with that burglary and she couldn't sleep at night. Under their watch, tragically, that's not an unusual case. So can the Prime Minister tell us what's the charge rate for theft and burglary across the country?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, since 2019, neighbourhood crime is down by 25%. But he asked rightly about what's happening with rape cases. So let me just tell him that we are on track to meet our target of doubling the number of rape cases that are reaching our courts. Since the Rape Review Action Plan was published, we've seen police referrals double. We've seen charges double. And last year, there was a 65% increase in rape convictions. Yes. But importantly, we also changed the law to ensure that rapists would spend more time in prison. But what did his shadow policing minister say? Prison doesn't prevent crime. It tells you everything that you need to know about the Labour Party. You can't trust them to keep Britain safe.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stands there and pretends that everything's fine. He is so totally out of touch. He needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and Mr. Speaker, I don't mean...
It's a big day today in the House, and it's a very important day. We do want to make progress. Holding us up is not advantageous to any of us.
Mr. Speaker, he needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and I don't mean to Malibu, to the streets of Britain. Go there and tell people it's all fine and see what reaction he gets. The answer he didn't want to give, although he knows it, is 4% of cases, 4% of burglary charges are charged. 96% of theft and burglary cases not even going before the courts. Burglars twice as likely to get away with it now as they were a decade ago. They should be ashamed of that record. And that cul-de-sac in Armthorpe has apparently seen 10 burglaries in 18 months, but only one of them has resulted in a prosecution. So rather than boasting and blaming others, why doesn't he tell the country when he's going to get the theft and burglary charge rate back to where it was before they wrecked policing?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say North Yorkshire's a lot further away than North London.
The lines as well, but I prefer to hear them rather than jeering. Come on, Prime Minister. Mister. Now then, we are going to make progress. Mr. Shelbrooke will be buying the teas in the tea room if we're not careful. Come on, Prime
Minister. There'll be Yorkshire teas, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since the Conservatives came into power, crime is down 50%, Mr. Speaker. Violent crime down 40%. Burglary burglary. The honourable gentleman mentioned burglary. Burglary down 56%. Why? Because we've recruited 20,000 more police officers. We've given them the powers to tackle crime, and we've kept serious offenders in prison for longer. All they've done is vote against greater protections for emergency workers. They've opposed tougher sentences for violent criminals, and they are failing to give the police the powers that they need. It's the same old Labour, soft on crime, soft on criminals.
The only criminal investigation he's ever been involved in is the one that found him guilty of breaking the law. I've prosecuted countless rapists. On the Prime Minister, I want tougher...
Hold on. I am determined to hear the questions, whether it's the Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister, so I can... Sorry? I think you've got your first customer for tea, Mr. Kurtz. We keep having this little problem. We'll have no more. No then, just a moment. So please, let's get through and let's just show some respect to both people at dispatch boxes. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've prosecuted countless rapists and I support tougher sentences. But you have to catch the criminals first. And when 98% of rapists are not even being put before the court, that's a massive failure on the government. And if he wants to go to Armthorpe, which is in Yorkshire, why doesn't he go to that cul-de-sac when he gets out and about in Yorkshire and ask them about those 10 burglaries that haven't been prosecuted? The reality is, after 13 years of Tory government, they've done nothing on standards, neighbourhood policing has been shattered, and burglars and rapists walk the streets with impunity. Yep. It's the same every week from the Prime Minister, whether it's the cost of living crisis, crime running out of control, or the state of the NHS. Why is his answer always to tell this British people they've never had it so good?
Mr. Speaker, let me just address the issue the honourable gentleman raised, because I said at the time I respected the decision the police reached and I offered an unreserved apology. But for the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, at the moment that happened, there was a full investigation by a very senior civil servant. The findings of which confirmed that I had no advance knowledge about what had been planned, having arrived early for a meeting. But he doesn't need me to tell him that. He's probably spoken to the report's author much more frequently than I have.
Luke, the Prime Minister needs to answer the question. He doesn't need you to... I don't think we need any more. Let's keep it that way. Prime Minister.
Look, Mr. Speaker, we're getting on. We're halving inflation by paying 50% of people's energy bills and freezing fuel duty. We're cutting...
And it's the same for this side. Mr. Gwynn, I don't need any more from the backbenches here either. Can I just say, let's calm... Mr. Fabricant, not again. I'm just quite seriously, today's a very big day, some important decisions are going to be taken. So please, I want to get this House moving on. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're also cutting NHS waiting lists by resolving pay disputes and getting doctors back to work. And Mr. Speaker, we're stopping the boats with a new bill to tackle illegal migration. That's a Conservative government delivering on the people's priorities.
Holly Mumbycroft.
Can I thank my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for the efforts he has made to support the UK's steel industry? Can I tell him that we remain very concerned about job losses at British Steel in Scunthorpe? So will he today reassure my constituents in North Lincolnshire that we will never see the end of UK steelmaking under his watch?
Mr. Speaker, the UK steel industry can have no greater champion than my honourable friend. And I know that this must be a concerning time for British Steel employees, and we stand ready to work with her to support them. Now, she's right, industrial sectors, including steel, have been able to bid into competitive government funds worth £1 billion to help support them to cut emissions and become more energy efficient, and and the government's recently announced British Industry Supercharger Fund can help boost competitiveness in UK's key energy-intensive industries, and I look forward to working with her to ensure a thriving steel industry in our United Kingdom.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to PC Palmer, who so tragically lost his life in defence of this Parliament and indeed what we all stand for, democracy. Mr. Speaker, what worries the Prime Minister most about Brexit right now? Is it the likely 4% hit to UK productivity, or is it 3 former Tory leaders planning to vote down his deal this afternoon?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the Windsor framework represents.
Just to help the chamber, just help everybody. I understand it's true, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Windsor framework represents a good deal for the people and families and businesses of Northern Ireland. It restores the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and ensures Northern Ireland's place in our precious union. But what I would say to him, I was more intrigued to see the words of his own party's president, who just this past week have described his own party as being, in their words, in a tremendous mess.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that whilst Westminster is once again consumed by the damage being caused by Brexit, the public at home are facing the biggest fall in living standards ever, the highest tax burden since the end of the Second World War, and inflation at 10.4%. When are the Conservative Party and indeed the Labour Party going to realise that Brexit can't work?
Mr. Speaker, the actions that this government is taking are ensuring that fully half of most families' energy bills are being supported by this government. We're also making sure that we're delivering for people with the cutting NHS waiting lists, and that's something that we're happy to work with the Scottish Government to learn and share best practice with them on. But we're also, Mr. Speaker, delivering on the people's #1 priority, which is to stop the boats and end illegal migration.
Unemployment claimant rate has declined significantly over the last decade, but there are still vacancies to fill and specific groups to help. And on Monday, the Employment Minister and I visited Arnold Job Centre, where Kelsey and her team are welcoming local employers to speak directly to job seekers, and a dedicated 50-plus work coach is getting more from that bracket into work. So would my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the staff at Arnold and other job centres across the country on the proactive work that they're doing, and when time allows, will you come to visit Arnold Job Centre in person to see the great work they're doing?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend and join him in thanking all the staff at Arnold Job Centre for their hard work. I shall keep his kind invitation to visit in mind. He mentioned the over 50s, and he mentioned the over 50s, or as my right honourable friend the Chancellor described them, are more experienced workers, and he was right to focus on them, because together with the Work and Pension Secretary, we are putting in place a range of measures to help support them to return to and stay in the labour market, and that is something that not only will help us continue to bring inflation down, but will support those people to have healthy, productive, fulfilling lives.
Neil Hamby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government recently confirmed that Scotland generated and sent south 35 billion kilowatt hours of energy in 2021. That number will rise to 124 billion in less than 8 years' time. For this multi-billion-pound bounty, Scotland will see no revenue, no manufacturing or supply chain jobs. In our land of energy plenty, why should our people be cold and hungry and businesses failing as a result of his government's robbery? So what has the Prime Minister to say in defence of this naked exploitation of Scotland's people and its resources?
Mr. Speaker, actually, this government is a strong supporter of Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry. And actually, it's the economically illiterate policy of, I think, almost all opposition parties to prohibit any new exploration of fossil fuels in the North Sea, which would have us then pay billions of pounds to foreign energy companies and then ship that energy here with twice the carbon emissions. It is a completely absurd policy, Mr. Speaker, that's bad for our security, it's bad for our economy, and that's why we're better off with the Conservatives in charge.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The island has been getting a better deal in recent years, and I thank the Prime Minister for that, especially before he was a Prime Minister, when he was working with me in different roles when he was in government to make that happen, and I'm grateful. However, the island remains the only sizable island in the UK without a fixed link, separated from the mainland by sea, which does not receive a funding uplift to support local government services. And this injustice has been ongoing now for 50 years, and all the evidence, Mr. Speaker, shows that it costs more to provide local services on an island than on the mainland. Will the Prime Minister work with me and his ministers to overcome this injustice this year? Thank you.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaigning on behalf of his constituents. It was a pleasure to spend many happy childhood holidays on the island, and I enjoyed visiting him more recently there as well. The Isle of Wight Council will benefit from a 10% increase in their funding in cash terms for the next financial year, and have been awarded an additional £1 million in recognition of the unique circumstances of the island, as my honourable friend points out. But I will ensure that he does get a meeting with the Minister for Local Government to carry on the good work that he and I started and make sure that his local constituents get the support that they need.
Reb Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, we now know from the Telegraph's lockdown files that during COVID, at the very heart of government, science wasn't being followed and rational discourse had been abandoned. This had dire consequences for children's education, mortality rates amongst the elderly, the economy and access to the health service. Lessons must be learnt, Mr. Speaker, but we can't wait 10 years for the independent inquiry to tell us what we should do next time when the inevitable epidemic arrives. Will the Prime Minister agree to a short-term focused inquiry that can give us recommendations so that we do better next time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as with any public inquiry, the process and timing of the inquiry stages are for the independent chair to decide. As Baroness Hallett has previously set out, she intends to gather written evidence throughout this year, with public hearings also starting this year. They held a preliminary hearing in February which covered pandemic preparedness and resilience, and they've set out dates for preliminary hearings into core political and administrative decision-making across the UK throughout this month. But most importantly, the honourable gentleman will recognise it is an independent inquiry, and it's for the independent chair to set the terms.
Jerome Mayor.
Mr. Speaker, more than 1.5 million people living outside London stand to be impacted by the Mayor's new London-wide ultra-low emission zone. Labour and the Liberal Democrats, they're all for the ULEZ charge. They don't care about the cost of living crisis. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best way to protect commuters and small businesses from the spread of this unfair £12.50 a day tax is to vote Conservative on May the 4th?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think he also failed to mention that just this week we've seen Labour in Wales introduce more plans for further road charging as well, increasing cost pressures for public and businesses. And I'd urge the parties opposite to listen and stand up for the public and small businesses, just as the Conservatives do.
Anna Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When my wee brother was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis 8 years ago, it's fair to say it turned our lives upside down. I'm incredibly proud of the man he is and all that he's achieved whilst living with this life-limiting condition. And my Livingston constituent, Stephen Sharp, manages local football team the Fulshay in Stonyburn. He has Crohn's disease and he lives with a stoma. And he's like many of our constituents up and down the UK, living with a life-limiting condition, trying to provide for their families whilst holding down jobs with a condition and disease that wreaks havoc on their body. So, Mr. Speaker, given 1 in 4 people wait more than a year for diagnosis, will the Prime Minister and indeed the House support the campaign to cut the crap and get diagnosed early for Crohn's and colitis? And would he meet with my constituent Stephen and I to look at what more can be done for awareness, research and funding?
Can I thank the honourable lady for her question and pay tribute to, I think, her brother and also Stephen for everything that they're doing to raise awareness of this issue. I'd be very happy to meet with her and Stephen. It is something that I am familiar with, and it is a very difficult condition for people to live with, and it's right that they get the support and attention that they deserve, and I look forward to that discussion with her.
Sir Jeremy Wright. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Jamie Scott spent 4 weeks in a coma and remains seriously disabled as a result of a COVID vaccination. He and his family continue to believe that mass vaccination is the right policy, but it must also surely be right to ensure that that tiny minority who are seriously injured as a result are properly compensated. In the absence of court cases it's in no one's interest to litigate, the current limit on compensation is £120,000, even for very serious and lifelong injury, and anyone who is disabled by less than 60% gets nothing at all. That cannot be right. Will my right honourable friend look urgently at changing it?
Mr. Speaker, it is important to start by recognising the importance of vaccines in protecting us all, and not least the fantastic rollout of the COVID vaccines across the UK. But I am very sorry to hear about the case that my right honourable friend raises. In the extremely rare case of a potential injury from a vaccine covered by the scheme, a one-off payment can be awarded. This is not designed to be a compensation scheme, and it does not prevent the injured person in pursuing a legal compensation claim with the vaccine manufacturer. We are taking steps to reform vaccine damage payment schemes by modernising the operations and providing more timely outcomes. But of course, I'll be happy to talk to the honourable gentleman further about it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new inflation stats this morning show food inflation is at 18%, the highest in 45 years. Millions are living in food and fuel poverty because of this government's failures and political decisions to enable grotesque profiteering at the expense of our communities. How on earth can the Prime Minister claim his plan is working, or is it in his eyes? Is it a success that so many people are struggling with their weekly food shop?
Mr. Speaker, the figures that have been recently published showed that since 2010 there are 2 million fewer people living in poverty, thanks to the actions of this and previous Conservative governments. Of course, no one wants to see people struggling with week-to-week bills like food, which is why it's so imperative we stick to our economic plan, and as the OBR have said, we are on track to halve inflation by the end of this year. That is the most important thing we can do to ease the burden on people, and in the meantime we have a range of programmes, whether that's free school meals or indeed the holiday activities and food programme, to provide support to the most vulnerable families who need our help.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 million to improve transport links from Wednesbury to the rest of Black Country, 4 million for Wednesbury High Street, and last week, the most important part of the budget, the £22.5 million to leaven up Tipton Town Centre. Mr. Speaker, this government has put a vote of confidence in my communities, one they've not had for nearly 50 years. Can I ask my right honourable friend, delivery is going to be absolutely key on these projects, because he can ensure, using his good office, that we absolutely get this delivered on time and realise the potential of my communities in Tipton and Wednesbury.
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of his local communities. I'm delighted that we are investing across the West Midlands, but particularly in places like Wednesbury and Tipton, and again we will work with him to ensure that those investments are indeed delivered, working with the local councils, Transport for West Midlands and the West Midland Combined Authority. Those investments are going to transform people's lives and spread opportunity in his area, and he deserves enormous credit for making that happen.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, households in Gateshead have seen their energy bills triple over the last 2 years. They've endured not just the energy unit price increase, but the daily electricity standing charges increase from an average of 22 pence in 2019 to 58 pence from next month, an increase of 155% in standing charges, over £200 per year. To many of my constituents, particularly those in low-income households, this seems like a company tax just for having the temerity to be connected to the network. And these schemes will continue long after energy support schemes have ended. So will the Prime Minister commit to ending the regressive increases in standing charges and instruct Ofgem to return them to 2019 levels or even end them completely?
Mr. Speaker, thanks to the Chancellor, the government is providing support to a typical household energy bill, around half of that bill over the winter, support that was extended in the budget and will be worth £1,500 to a typical family. But we went further, Mr. Speaker, for those most vulnerable families. As the Chancellor announced, we will be ending the discrepancy between unit charges for those on prepayment meters, something that many in this House have called for, and also providing generous cost of living payments worth £900 to the most vulnerable families.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, two of my constituents, George and Carol Ellis, are my guests here in the gallery today. Sadly, in 2021, their son died by suicide. George was a member of the Yorkshire Regiment and had become depressed following one of his comrades who had taken his own life. In memory of George, Adrian and Carol have set up a support group which marries up one veteran with another who is able to talk through and hopefully help them. The support group is called Get Emotions Out, after George. Would the Prime Minister join me in offering condolences to Adrian and Carol and also his support for the work that they're now doing?
Can I join my honourable friend in sending my and the whole House's condolences to George's friends and family, and thank his parents for the brave work they are doing to raise awareness of veterans' mental health. Support is available for anyone experiencing suicidal thoughts, including from the Samaritans helpline. And thanks to the excellent work of my honourable friend, the Veterans Minister, we are working specifically to support veterans' mental health through Op Courage, which is a bespoke mental health and wellbeing service for veterans in the NHS, backed by considerable funding, which was increased in the recent budget. And that fully integrated service will be launched next month. But again, I pay tribute to George's parents for all the incredible work that they are doing.
Alison Thulis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Mariam Amiri, came to the UK from Afghanistan on a spousal visa back in 2016. The Home Office have just refused her renewal and advised she should return to Afghanistan. Mariam is an educator, due to start a university course in September. She's a valued community activist. She's a vocal opponent of the Taliban. She is married to a man who worked for British forces, and her family is currently being persecuted in Afghanistan. She's been trying to get them here since Afghanistan fell. Can the Prime Minister think of any barriers or hardships Mariam might face in returning to a country where there is not even any means of applying for a visa? And will he personally intervene, as the Immigration Minister is yet to reply to me, despite raising this 3 weeks ago?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on an individual's visa case, but I will ensure that the Honourable Lady gets a response from the Home Office with regard to that particular case.
Len Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister to pay tribute to and congratulate my constituent Max Woozy, best known as the boy in the tent, whose 3-year adventure camping outside is drawing to a close. To date, he has raised over £750,000 for the excellent North Devon Hospice, and will my right honourable friend wish everyone taking part in his final adventure, a camping festival at Broomhill Estate, great success.
Well, can I join my honourable friend in paying tribute to Max and everyone else taking part in this fantastic initiative, and congratulate them on raising such a considerable sum of money for a very worthy local cause, and I look forward to hearing how the rest of it goes, but very well done.
Final question, Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the Treasury receives an additional £65 billion revenue from Scotland's oil and gas, they've only allocated £20 billion for carbon capture, but nothing for Scotland. They've cut the renewable energy budget by a third. They've only allocated £10 million for Scotland's world-leading tidal stream and failed to back pump storage hydro. But yet they want us to contribute our share towards the £35 billion Sizewell C nuclear power station. Isn't it the case that within the Union, Scotland is the energy, but Westminster takes the powers?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only are we supporting Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry, we're also providing £20 billion of funding for further carbon capture and storage, and does want to work and provide clarity for Acorn regarding their future path. But also, I think the honourable gentleman raised the issue of tidal power, and I am pleased to tell him that actually that is now included in the contracts for difference allocations, and there's 40 megawatts of new tidal stream power by 4 projects across Scotland and Wales in the last year. That's this government delivering energy security across the United Kingdom.
Complete questions.
There of PMQs, Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, having to quieten down both sides, and indeed we heard from Sir Keir Starmer in terms of the discussion over crime. You should be ashamed of yourselves when the Tory benches were shouting across the floor there. But certainly tough on crime, tough on the blame for crime, maybe we can paraphrase that. In terms of reacting to what we heard in the Casey report yesterday, an easy line of attack, but Sunak coming back, the Prime Minister coming back basically with lots of statistics that may confuse people to a degree.
Well, I don't think it will confuse people in terms of the reality that they're seeing on the streets, and I think that's one of the problems that Rishi Sunak has, is that whatever he says in Parliament, people see the reality. They see 1.6% of rape cases leading to charge. They see that the number of people who've been burgled, half as many are being charged. They see on their streets a smaller police presence. We know there was a 20,000 reduction in police over the first few years, and the police are still attempting to bring those back. So I think the problem that Rishi Sunak has is that the reality that people experience bears no relationship to what he's saying on there, and that's why I think it was quite powerful, sort of cheeky if you like, for Keir Starmer to say he ought to get out of Westminster, but it was powerful because people listen to Rishi Sunak and they think he just hasn't got a clue what we're experiencing.
Right, and Sir Lindsay Hoyle did acknowledge there's some quite good one-liners today, but of course the Prime Minister coming back with I'm in North Yorkshire while you're in North London.
I'm a member of the Home Affairs and Justice Select Committee in Parliament. I was a criminal defence solicitor for 17 years. What Keir Starmer should be ashamed of is his role as DPP during...
Director of Public Prosecutions.
Director of Public Prosecutions. He did nothing, the barefaced cheek of him, he did nothing to confront the culture that the Casey Review has highlighted
within
in
the
police
Met
forces throughout the country. His 2011 charging direction regarding rape cases, in my view, is directly responsible for where we are now. He had a catalogue of disasters as the DPP. His hypocrisy is staggering. I mean, I could accept it if he was doing something else, if he was talking about something else, but his record on this is absolutely appalling, and the damage that he did as the DPP to some of the underlying tenets of the Crown Prosecution Service and how victims were protected and approached is something that he should be ashamed of, and he should be apologising before the House for that.
So his assertion that burglars and rapists walk the streets with impunity, you would put that maybe that's partially to do with his tenure at the DPP.
He was talking about serious sexual offending at the start of this. I fully accept, if anybody wants to see my contributions to Parliament, the charge-out rates for offending at this moment in time are not acceptable. They simply are not acceptable. We can't have a system where you've got a 2% charge-out rate for rape allegations. There are some fundamental problems in the system, but when Keir Starmer talks about let's have rape and serious sexual offending units, why didn't he do that when he was DPP? Why didn't he put in place those processes that he's now claiming that we need? Why didn't he call for mandatory screening of police officers back when he was DPP working with them? The reason is he's an ultimate hypocrite. He will say anything, literally anything.
But why would the Tories not accept that there needs to be a national structure in terms of how police recruits are vetted? I mean, surely that's common sense.
Well, it is obviously common sense in terms of the vetting procedure.
So why is it not there?
Well,
you've had 13 years to put it in place.
One of the things, when you look at the Metropolitan Police, the Metropolitan Police and where I'm an MP, Greater Manchester Police, both Labour Police and Crime Commissioners, utterly disastrous. In Greater Manchester, we were put into special measures because of Andy Burnham's negligence. The same thing with Sadiq Khan. They have a record of complete disaster in not protecting victims, and then come on the TV and in Parliament saying things like this.
And Rishi Sunak did come back at Keir Starmer with this line from the Casey report about the Mayor of London, that the relationship between the Met and the Mayor was dysfunctional.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because...
The Labour Mayor, we should add.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, Secondly, I refute completely what James just said about Keir Starmer's record at DPP to sort of try and suggest, well, when he was at DPP, he ought to run the police as well. And utter nonsense. And what it really powerfully shows is that this government, at every turn, will try and, despite 13 years in power, try and turn the blame on someone else. And that's, of course, what they're doing with Sadiq Khan. I remember when Sadiq Khan asked Dame Cressida Dick to move on. We had various voices on the right demanding that he didn't. Yeah, absolutely, demanding that he didn't do that. And now I think he's been absolutely validated in that. And I think that the Casey report is a serious one. It also made clear that austerity and the policing cuts were responsible for many of these failings. So the government have to take responsibility after 13 years for the fact that people are less safe in their beds than they were.
Yeah, and clearly the indication from the fire from both sides is that this is a touchstone policy for a general election.
No, I completely understand that. But do you know who else needs to take responsibility? Those people over the last 15, 20 years who've been in senior positions within the criminal justice system who completely don't accept. Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions. His role in where we are today is he's completely culpable from that. He changed the system.
Why did Rishi Sunak not come back at him with that particular sort of line of defence? I mean, going on, obviously, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, we can understand why, because there's specific allegations concerning the Met. But if this is actually so important, surely that's something that Rishi Sunak should have been prepared to do, and he should have been briefed to do that.
You'll have to, in terms of the people who briefed him, well, unfortunately, I'm not in the room in respect of that. All I can give you, Mark, is my real-life experience of actually being in the courts and dealing with people who had these experiences. And the hypocrisy of the man is startling.
Right. Just on one particular line, which, again, taking in Lindsay Hoyle's some good lines, Keir Starmer saying the only investigation the Prime Minister has been involved in ended with him being fined over Partygate. A bit below the belt?
Well, listen, this is Keir Starmer. Nothing is off the table, is it? Below the belt, no problem whatsoever. This is the man.
That's PMQs, though, isn't it? You trade blows.
Well, if that's the way that he wants to debate things, that's a matter for him. But perhaps that shows the type of individual that he is. That he's going to say things like that. Just remember, Mark, this is the man who has his own pension pot, a bespoke pension pot just for Keir Starmer. So he sent Toby and other Labour MPs to vote against a tax policy.
Just to explain to people, when he was at DPP, his pension position meant that he was not under the lifetime limit. It was a different structure. Although one reflects that MPs actually themselves have got quite a nice little pension set up.
So he benefits from a scheme that he wouldn't allow senior doctors and other workers to have. Right. When we're talking about hypocrisy, the charge sheet against him is endless.
OK. Just one last thought. Quite an effective weapon, if you like, from Sir Keir Starmer on the Armthorpe cul-de-sac in Yorkshire, where he specifically honed in on their experiences. One expects maybe that politicians of both sides are going to be beating a path to there to actually find out what's going on, because clearly that's going to be the battleground, one of the battlegrounds for a general election.
Yeah, it is. I think we've also seen Keir Starmer's absolutely confident on taking on the Tories on crime. Yeah, it was historically seen as a Conservative strength. It absolutely isn't now. Yeah. I think Keir Starmer's track record, I think a lot of what James is saying, none of that's what Tory Prime Ministers were saying when Keir Starmer stood down as Director of Public Prosecutions. They were hugely complimentary about him. Now that he's the leader of the Labour Party, of course, they're changing their tune on all of that.
And you might expect that.
Well, but the point is, there was no sort of desire to get rid of him at that time.
OK.
It's only afterwards. But no, I think you're right. I think Keir Starmer's made it clear today what one of the battlegrounds for the next general election will be, and it's one we're very confident of fighting on.
OK, let's just update people. We've got the Windsor Framework deal, the vote. The Prime Minister's saying, amidst those SNP criticisms, the Windsor Framework represents a good deal for the people and family and businesses of Northern Ireland. Clearly, Labour is going to vote for it to actually perhaps put the Prime Minister in a more difficult position, so we know where you'll be voting. And just remind us where you're going to be voting.
I'm voting in favour.
Yeah, and the reason being?
Because I think it's a good deal for the people of Northern Ireland.
Right, so basically backing the Prime Minister's
position.
Absolutely, 100%. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for the moment. More to come, of course, another day of high drama in Westminster. Not just that vote, but also certain Boris Johnson in front of a committee as well. We'll update you with the latest. Stay with us.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live on this afternoon of high political drama. We just had PMQs. Next, of course, we've got the vote coming up this afternoon on the so-called Windsor Framework, the Northern Ireland deal. Rishi Sunak could be facing a damaging rebellion over that deal on post-Brexit trading arrangements for Northern Ireland. Tory hardliners, members of the ERG, saying they will be voting against the government in the Commons later. DUP, of course, 8 MPs at Westminster to vote against. And also 2 former Prime Ministers, a certain Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. But what's the assessment in Northern Ireland itself? Let's join Doogie Beattie now in Belfast. And Doogie, you're at Erskine House, not at Stormont this time, of course, where Chris Heaton-Harris holds court there. What are they making of these various announcements, not just from the DUP, but the ERG and 2 former Prime Ministers, as we said?
Well, most politicians here are taking that with a pinch of salt. For, of course, the ERG voted for the first controversial protocol that started this whole ball rolling in the first place. So most of them are not taking much notice of it. It's pretty much, as it was said to me, rubbing jam around their face. The whole point of this vote, of course, is to get Stormont back up and running, and you have to ask the question, is the juice worth the squeeze? Well, it's not going to be, because, of course, no unionist will go back into government. It's not just the DUP, the TUV, a True Unionist Voice, the PUP, and even the UUP haven't kicked it out, but they have said it's a stepping stone, so it's no great endorsement of the deal. There's too many things now. The spin has wore off. It's went on too long, and too many things are starting to show. Things like state aid, that could be affected rather badly under European laws. They can't, no politician here in Northern Ireland can change that. That could also hit the UK quite hard, because of course single farm payment is seen as state aid, and Northern Ireland produces anything up to 20% of the food that goes into the UK, and we've been hearing today about the high cost of groceries and inflation figures on that particular thing. We also look at the small boat crisis, Mark, that there would be nothing stopping then these small boats then going straight into Dublin, coming across a borderless country, and under EU law we would still have to have the free movement of people, and of course with the common travel area they just get on a boat and go across unchecked back into the UK again. So politicians have to look at that in the round, and I suppose local politicians here should be asking the questions of where that stands with state aid. They should be asking the questions of how we can act in both sides, because the EU has pretty much said in this that they will not be disadvantaged at any one time. And if you really took a look at what is going on at Stormont. It's not going to get it back. The unionists here have, and I've been here many times with Chris Eaton Harris, have said, look, we haven't been in those negotiations, and they keep bringing us back the wrong part of the deal. They are looking for a dual regulation deal rather than a deal that holds them inside the EU.
Right, OK, and on that particular note, I mean, what are they making there of this indication or announcement from James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, that he will be meeting Maros Sefcovic from the EU on Friday for the Windsor Pact to be formally adopted, i.e. that the horse is already bolted?
Well, I do fear for that, Mark. There is... That may set Northern Ireland back decades, I'm afraid, if that does happen and they push this on through. The temperature in Northern Ireland, the political temperature, there are those that have taken it and have allowed the politicians who keep on saying to others, leave it to us, we will sort it, we will sort it. I would fear for Northern Ireland at that point, Mark.
OK, we'll see what the reaction is on Friday on that particular score. Doogie, for the moment, thank you for that. But let's come back to two MPs here in the studio who will be heading to the Commons, of course, to vote as well, James Daly and Toby Perkins. James, first of all, the potential damage to Rishi Sunak in a political sense. Priti Patel has announced that she'll be a potential rebel. Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, who would be the third leader, but obviously there was an intervention from a certain Theresa May when it was announced two previous party leaders will be voting against. So three party leaders, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. What is that going to do for Rishi Sunak's position within the party?
Absolutely nothing. It has no impact whatsoever. People who have long-held views I respect. Others who have put in front of MPs previously deals which have turned out to not be acceptable to now taking this position is somewhat ironic, I feel. So I don't think it matters one jot in terms of the Prime Minister's authority. The Prime Minister has shown himself to be a man who can negotiate with the EU to bring back what I consider. Doogie painted a pretty stark picture.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask a question on that. I mean, OK, he can actually, withstand the views of three former leaders, but there are 8 DUP MPs who will vote against. But it's what's going to happen then in Stormont and Northern Ireland that's going to be the really important thing.
Well, all of us want Stormont to be re-established, want it to be functioning. You know, the governance of Northern Ireland has not been as it should be for a long, long time. And having been somebody who's been over there with various select committees, that is really having a negative impact on the services that people are having on the ground there. So I think this is yes, it is a compromise, but compromise is not always a dirty word. It's trying to find a way, in line with the expectations of the Good Friday Agreement, to ensure that everyone's interests are represented and everyone in Northern Ireland has a chance for a new, positive, prosperous future.
Is that going to happen if this vote goes through and as we say, cleverly on Friday, basically formally adopts the pact? And that's not going to get Stormont back to...
No, I fear it isn't. I think that the DUP, did a deal with Boris Johnson, and just like many other people who've found themselves close to Boris Johnson over the years, they've come to rue that relationship, and they feel very badly let down. I think it is. I agree with James that it's terrible for the people of Northern Ireland. They don't have a government, but there is. I also think it's problematic that Northern Ireland is a country that actually voted more to remain than to leave. But if you were to listen to debates in the British Parliament, that voice is almost entirely missing. The SDLP have got a couple of MPs as a result of the 2019 elections, but for a lot of that time, because Sinn Féin choose not to take their seats, it did feel in Parliament like the only voice from Northern Ireland was that from the DUP. And I think, whilst I understand Sinn Féin's position, I think it's regrettable that voice of those people speaking up for those who want a close relationship with Ireland was so missing from the whole debate.
Yeah, and in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which of course was Boris Johnson's answer, that's dead in the water, I guess.
It appears so, yeah, and I think that it's interesting to hear James say that Boris Johnson's vote didn't make any difference. I think there are many people in the Conservative Party who won't view it like that. He still has a huge power within that party, and he's still there as the sort of ghost of Christmas past for Rishi Sunak looking over his shoulder.
ghost of Christmas or the ghost of Westminster Pass or Stormont Pass, maybe. I don't know.
I don't think so. I think the fundamental issue for a lot of Conservatives is the Union is central to our political identity.
Conservative and Unionist Party.
Yes, exactly. And the question is, does this agreement make it more likely that the Union will survive? Will survive. Now, you know, we have to balance that with the economic and social well-being of everyone in Northern Ireland.
And the red and blue and green channels in terms of the
unique circumstance that Northern Ireland finds itself in. I think there's going to be some real positive benefits for this deal, and hopefully, I share Toby's concerns regarding the executive coming back in. But I do see a really positive future for Northern Ireland. Right. And it does involve, unfortunately, people don't like this word, but it does involve compromise with the European Union. OK, gentlemen, thank you both. Your taxis are waiting to get back to Westminster to vote. Thank you for being with us. More to come here on GB News Live. Stay with us.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
It's 1 o'clock. A very good afternoon and welcome to GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst. Coming up for you this lunchtime. Day of judgment in an hour's time. Boris Johnson to face that committee of MPs who will decide whether he intentionally misled Parliament over Partygate and could decide whether his political career is over. The former Prime Minister says he's looking forward to giving evidence. But he's also announced that he'll join Liz Truss in voting against Rishi Sunak's Northern Ireland Brexit deal. Former Eurosceptic Steve Baker says he risks becoming a pound shop Nigel Farage. We'll be asking what currency the Windsor framework now holds. And club for sale, who'll buy Manchester United? And could it put them in the red? Because the asking price may be over £6 billion. Can British entrepreneur Sir Jim Ratcliffe beat the Qataris at their own game? The whistle on bids being blown at 9 tonight. But before all that, latest news headlines coming up now with Aaron.
Good afternoon, it's 1:01. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. The committee investigating whether Boris Johnson knowingly misled Parliament over Partygate has published fresh evidence this morning. The 110-page report contains photos of gatherings Mr Johnson attended and witness statements, including one from his cabinet secretary at the time, Simon Case, who claims he never assured Mr Johnson all rules had been followed. A separate account says Mr Johnson had the opportunity to shut down gatherings in Downing Street, but instead joined in. The evidence will be referred to when Mr Johnson answers questions in front of a panel of MPs in an hour's time. The former Prime Minister maintains he didn't deliberately mislead the Commons, but Shadow Justice Secretary Steve Reid believes the truth will catch up with him.
I genuinely think that Boris Johnson's attempt yesterday to try and trash the committee is because he suspects he's going to be found to have misled the House of Commons, and therefore there will be a sanction. So he's trying to throw, as he so often does, a smokescreen around himself to hide from responsibility for his own actions. But I'm afraid for Boris Johnson, it does look like he's finally going to come into collision with the truth for once in his life, and we'll see where that takes us in the next few days.
Well, you can watch Boris Johnson in front of the Privileges Committee live here on GB News from 2 o'clock. The European Research Group of Eurosceptic Tory MPs is recommending its members vote against Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. A key element of the Windsor framework aims to give the Stormont Assembly a greater say on how EU rules apply to the province. But the Prime Minister could be facing a sizable Conservative rebellion when MPs vote on the Stormont break later. That will include Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Sammy Wilson and his DUP colleagues have already indicated they'll vote against the regulations.
It's not a case of it not being pure Brexit. It's not even democracy, because a part of the United Kingdom will be subject to laws which are made at Brussels with no say from the United Kingdom or Northern Ireland. The compromise that would be required if we were to accept EU law is that we decide that we, as unionists, compromise on being part of the United Kingdom, because we'd be longer subject to United Kingdom law.
However, the Northern Ireland Minister, Steve Baker, says the Windsor framework is an improvement on Boris Johnson's protocol bill and has urged him to get behind it.
The protocol bill would have put in place a red and a green channel for goods going to Northern Ireland, but in using that bill, we would wreck our relations with the European Union and damage our standing internationally. Now, that was a price we were willing to pay to get just the kind of arrangements we now have in the Windsor framework. So really, both of them should be backing the Windsor framework today.
The Labour leader says crime's out of control and people are paying the price for a government that never takes responsibility. Speaking in the Commons at Prime Minister's questions, Sir Keir Starmer challenged Rishi Sunak, asking if he accepted the findings of Baroness Casey's damning report in full. She found the Met Police to be institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. Well, Sir Keir says, after 13 years of Tory government, crime is out of control, but Rishi Sunak says only the Conservatives can be trusted on policing.
What did his shadow policing minister say? Prison doesn't prevent crime. It tells you everything that you need to know about the Labour Party. You can't trust them to keep Britain safe.
Mr. Speaker, he needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and I don't mean to Malibu, to the streets of Britain. Go there and tell people it's all fine and see what reaction he gets.
Well, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition both referring to Baroness Casey's report, and she and the Met Police Commissioner have been facing MPs. Speaking to the London Assembly Police and Crime Committee at City Hall, Sir Mark Rowley welcomes the report's findings and hopes it acts as a catalyst for change.
It calls out discrimination in the organisation, not just about the individuals, the racists, the homophobes, misogynists, but also the systemic failings within it, the management failings and the cultural failings. Secondly, it talks to a culture which isn't sufficiently orientated to looking at what we deliver from the perspective of the victims and the communities of London. And thirdly, it talks to a workforce of a majority of good, passionate, vocational people who don't feel set up to succeed.
Surging food prices unexpectedly pushed inflation up last month, increasing fears of another rise in interest rates. The Office for National Statistics says it's the result of higher price growth in restaurants, clothing and food, which hit its highest rate in more than 45 years. And that was partly driven by a shortage of vegetables. The Bank of England will make their next interest rate decision tomorrow. Most economists, including Laurie Laird, were taken by surprise.
These are pretty bad numbers. We all expected inflation to fall a little bit to below 10%. We actually went up. We went up to an annual rate of 10.4%. No one saw this coming. It's a lot worse than anyone expected. It means inflation's going the wrong way. The government wants to see it go down. The Bank of England wants to see it go down.
The UK's energy import bill more than doubled to £117 billion in the last year. The Offshore Energies UK report says it's the first time yearly energy import costs have broken the £100 billion barrier, and that equates to something like £4,200 per household. Last year, the UK spent $63 billion on crude oil, petrol, diesel and other oil-based fuels, with a further $49 billion on gas. This is GB News. More as it happens, but now let's get back to Mark.
So, the big show at Westminster this afternoon. Boris Johnson set to face that committee of MPs at 2 o'clock to present his defence as to whether he misled Parliament over Partygate. If he is found to have deliberately misled the House, he could be suspended as an MP and his political career could be at an end. Our Deputy Political Editor Tom Harwood sets the scene for us with a dramatic afternoon ahead.
Boris Johnson resigned as Prime Minister on the 7th of July last year. Over 8 months later, and the scandal that dislodged the man who won his party their largest election victory since Margaret Thatcher is still being litigated in Parliament. The issue being adjudicated by a committee of 7 MPs is not whether Boris Johnson broke the rules or not, but rather whether he recklessly and knowingly misled the House of Commons.
All guidance was followed completely.
Conor Burns, a close ally of Mr Johnson, says he believes that the former Prime Minister will set the record straight.
Well, I think Boris is really looking forward to getting his side out there, getting the factual information that he has at his disposal into the public domain and on the record. All I want for Boris Johnson is what I would want for any other Member of Parliament, in fact, frankly, for any one of my constituents, and that is a transparent and fair process, and crucially, that they separate out the events in Downing Street and Cabinet Office and so on, and what they're actually looking at, which is what he said to Parliament and what he knew when he said it to Parliament.
The impartiality of the committee has been called into question.
Harriet Harman did, of course, send a fairly clear tweet in April last year, where she said if the then Prime Minister and the then Chancellor, the now former Prime Minister Boris, the current Prime Minister Rishi, accepted a fixed penalty notice, in her view that would be an admission of guilt and therefore an admission that they had misled Parliament. I struggle to reconcile Harriet's impartiality in this process with that tweet that she sent so definitively in judgment in April last year.
The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, however, believes the question of integrity does not lie with the committee, but instead with its subject.
Persons whose integrity is on the line is Boris Johnson's. He's never had any integrity in his whole political career, and his performance as Prime Minister was an embarrassment to the country. I think there's a difference between understanding when there's a party and when there isn't a party. He knows he went to a party. It's pretty clear to anyone that he did mislead Parliament, and he knew he was doing so. Let's see what happens at the hearing. But I think the vast majority of people have moved on from Boris Johnson. I saw a Prime Minister who lacked any integrity and who clearly misled Parliament.
Boris Johnson will be relying on his distinguished legal counsel, Lord Pannick KC, and this 55-page dossier of information, which contains newly published WhatsApps and phone records showing that the former Prime Minister had asked his team what happened at events and was assured by them that the rules were followed. But ultimately it will be for the committee to adjudicate after hours of grilling, and then for Parliament to vote on any sanction that may be recommended. Tom Harwood, GB News.
Well, I'm glad to say Tom can join us now in the studio as the clock ticks down, not to high noon, but high 2 o'clock. Just to set the scene, the Grimmond Room, named after Joe Grimmond, a committee room, 7 MPs, 4 Tory, 2 Labour, and 1 SNP. Just to explain to everyone watching and listening, this is not a court of law, a quasi-judicial hearing even. There's no legal status. So, therefore, the MPs don't have to decide beyond reasonable doubt, but on the balance of probability.
That's right, and although it won't be formally a legal process, it will feel a bit like a legal process. Boris Johnson will be sitting there, not quite on trial, but certainly being inspected by these 7 MPs sitting in a horseshoe opposite him. He'll be flanked by his legal team, not least Lord Pannick, who is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords.
A King's Counsel, no less,
who has been advising Boris Johnson through this. And, of course, this committee can then recommend a sanction if it decrees that Boris Johnson has, in its view, recklessly misled Parliament. And we'll get on to that.
Yeah, because that's the key phrase, or two words, isn't it? Is knowingly or recklessly misleading Parliament.
Absolutely, and the traditional way in which the Privileges Committee deals with situations like this, because this is not the first time that a minister, however senior or junior, has been accused of misleading the House. The question that usually is asked by the Privileges Committee is, did they knowingly mislead the House? Were they acting on the information that they had to their best of their knowledge at that time? And that's a pretty tricky question to answer.
Yeah.
Interestingly, this iteration of the Privileges Committee, chaired by Harriet Harman, the Labour MP, who has been seen to have said some pretty disparaging things.
Well, Conor Burns basically indicating or calling into question how independent she can be as the chair.
Absolutely, and this is the problem, really. 7 MPs sitting on there, a majority of whom who have said things about Boris Johnson in the past that aren't the most effusively positive things, and yet they are politicians who sort of have to leave politics at the door. Whether they can do that or not is an open question. But the crucial point is that the terms of reference have changed.
Right.
Not just knowingly misled Parliament, but recklessly. And what does that mean? Because that is something that hasn't really been tested to a great extent in the House of Commons before. One argument from some lawyers is that what recklessly means is Boris Johnson goes in, hasn't really read his notes and just said, oh, I'm sure that all the rules were followed without having done his due diligence.
And therefore him saying in good faith that he is arguing that I told the Commons what I believed to be the case because I was doing that in good faith.
And yet that could still be found against by the committee. If they say he was reckless in doing that, if he didn't do his due diligence, if he didn't check to the full extent with his civil servants. However, of course, Boris Johnson has produced a 55-page document saying he did check with his civil servants. And he's produced WhatsApp messages and phone records saying that there were no rule-breaking parties.
The committee has this morning at 9 o'clock issued 110 pages, double the amount of the former Prime Minister.
You wonder if that's deliberate or not.
Well, one wonders. You may say that. I couldn't possibly comment. However, Jack Doyle, former communications chief, denied telling Boris Johnson that the COVID-19 guidance was followed at all times. But I said I believed no rules were broken.
Exactly.
A number 10 official saying, this is in regards to the press room, I could see what was happening and he allowed the situation to continue. Simon Case, Cabinet Secretary, I did not give Johnson assurances that guidance had been adhered to at all times. So there is actually a lot of detailed evidence that the committee has got in front of it.
And this is the crucial point that I think we'll be hearing a lot of in about an hour's time. What's the difference between rules and guidance?
Yeah.
The law versus the guidance. And Boris Johnson in the House of Commons seemed to have used these two phrases almost indistinguishably, sort of chopping and changing. The rules were followed, the guidance was followed. Well, in legal terms, they have different meanings. And the evidence that the committee has put together and published today says that Boris Johnson was assured that rules weren't broken, but wasn't assured that guidance wasn't broken. Now, Boris Johnson will be saying that he was referring to specific instances when he was speaking about guidance in the Commons. But then again, it is a very difficult line to walk. At what point can you say that Boris Johnson was telling the truth about rules but not about guidance? This is some of the weeds, some of the detail that they'll really have to thrash out.
Yeah, and just very quickly as well, in terms of the Boris Johnson show, of course, he dropped the other bombshell this morning that he'll be voting against this Windsor framework along with Liz Truss. I mean, was that to perhaps the dead cat approach, as we, he put a dead cat on the table, everyone talks about that and not the other thing?
I think it's very, very hard for us to not be talking about the inquisition that is taking place in Parliament, the 2 to 5 hours of questioning that we'll see. I think it's very hard to distract from that, but it is crucial to note that a couple of weeks ago, Boris Johnson gave a speech in London where he indicated he wasn't happy with the Windsor framework. He didn't say which way he would vote, but he said he would find it very difficult to vote for it. Potentially, this is following that thread.
OK. Tom, for the moment, thank you for that. No one expects the parliamentary inquisition. Well, at least Boris Johnson does, because it's going to happen at 2 o'clock. So let's get the views now of Scarlett Maguire, former Labour advisor and broadcaster and journalist. Scarlett, is it going to be yet again the Boris Johnson show?
Of course, it's going to be the Boris Johnson show. I mean that's what he's going to make it all about. The question is whether he can answer the questions honestly. And Tom has just said that, he might have put a 55-page dossier out saying he was told everything was fine, but actually the people who he quoted are saying, no, we didn't. I mean, what we don't know about this 55-page dossier is how much was hand-picked and how much was everything there is. The good thing about this inquisition is that it's going to be very, very public, so that afterwards everybody can know exactly what happened. It's very good that Boris Johnson has put out his dossier. It's very good that the committee have put out their dossier. Everything is going to be public so that nobody can say, this is the dark arts.
Yeah, and as we just discussed with Tommy, it is not a court of law, so therefore we don't need the weight of evidence, if you like, beyond reasonable doubt. It just has to be on the balance of probability. So therefore, all the various reflections, if we can put that, from the likes of Jack Doyle, from Simon Case and other unnamed officials, will really have resonance.
Oh, they certainly will have resonance. I mean, if they say, but we never said it like that, we said rules were not broken. I mean, of course it matters. No, it's not a court of law. But the thing about a court of law is once it's over, and you're guilty or you're not guilty. The thing about what's important about this committee is, that Parliament as a body voted that the committee would look at it. They've never questioned that Harriet Harman is the right chair, and a Tory, there are 4 Conservatives on the committee, 2 Labour. They've never questioned that Harriet Harman should be chair. But also, once the committee makes their mind up, then it goes back to Parliament. And Rishi Sunak has indicated, the Conservatives have indicated, it's going to be a free vote. So actually, what they do afterwards is as important. What they do with the evidence is as important as what they do now. We also have to remember that there has been a campaign against this committee since it was set up. I mean, mainly, in the Mail on Sunday, but Boris's allies have been trying to discredit this committee for months.
OK, well, we'll see what, as you say, I think formal apology or suspension are 2 of the things at their behest. And as you say, then, of course, we go into the parliamentary vote and what happens there, even though if it's a free vote. Scarlett, for the moment, thank you for that. And, of course, we'll have the committee up at 2 o'clock. But let's reflect on some other major stories, of course, today, with the Chinese President Xi Jinping having left Moscow this morning after telling Vladimir Putin through a translator, right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. And we are the ones driving these changes together. What does that mean? Let's speak now to Chief Foreign Affairs commentator for the Financial Times and author of The Age of Strongman, Gideon Rachman. Gideon, thank you for your time. And indeed, we've got the photos on the front of the FT there of shaking hands and the peace plan and so on. However, was this a bit of show or is there real substance behind it?
Well, I mean, I think that that's one of the big questions, because we don't know what they talked about for 4.5 hours. There are a few fairly bland public statements put out, but I think the really big issue that they wouldn't admit to publicly is whether China will begin to supply Russia with ammunition, because essentially, as far as we know, Russia is running short of shells. It's one of the reasons they don't attack Ukrainian infrastructure on a daily basis. It's quite sporadic now. They're short of missiles, and China's got a lot of the kind of missiles that Russia needs. However, if they were to actually give those to the Russians, it would be seen as a major intervention in the war. The Americans have constantly warned them against doing so. It would be a very big escalation if they did that. Aside
and we had
from the
Jens
weapons, there are all
Stoltenberg
sorts of other things going on, the energy cooperation and the ideological kind of convergence. But I think weapons is the really big one.
Yeah, we had Jens Stoltenberg from NATO indicating that perhaps lethal aid, as they described it, hasn't been delivered as yet, but certainly that Russia was asking China. Do you believe that Xi will go down that road, bearing in mind he's already sort of been conspicuously silent on the whole issue of a gas pipeline? Perhaps he's just looking for, what China can actually get from this in terms of trade advantage rather than getting itself into hot water.
Well, I mean, I think that there's clearly, even in a closed society like China, you can see there are debates going on in Beijing about it. There are hawks who say, yes, we should supply the Russians with weapons. And if you look at Xi's rhetoric, it's the kind of thing, that you referred to about this changes we haven't seen for 100 years, Russia and China driving them together. They do both see themselves as challenging American power around the world. But the question he's got to face is, does he want to ramp it up now? I suspect, but that probably they won't do it openly, that they'll supply them with some stuff, semiconductors and so on, but not the artillery shells right now. But I think if Russia were on the point of losing, or if they look like there might be regime change in Moscow, then I think you might get a rethink in China.
OK, your book was, as I said, is The Age of the Strongman. Is one of the things we take from this that Putin is no longer the strongman, that clearly Xi holds all the cards, and that Russia may well be in their behest now?
I think so. I mean, I think it's a rather humbling position for the Russians to be in. The official rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin was, this is a meeting of equals, etc. And that was the choreography. But there's no doubt about it. I mean, Russia is now, not just on the military front, but particularly on the economic front, completely dependent on China, because they've lost the Western energy markets, which their whole economy was really oriented to for the last 20 years. Russia's really their only big customer left for the gas. They're trying to build this new gas pipeline towards China. And in fact, Putin actually said, we're a little bit envious of your economic success. The Chinese economy is just massively larger than that of Russia's. And if you really wanted to be nervous sitting in Moscow, it is the case that there are parts of Russia that used to be part of China in the 19th century. So I think there is this concern that, if the balance of power between the two countries gets too out of whack, Russia could potentially even be in some peril. But for the moment, the reality is that they're very close allies. But Xi is much more, Putin is much more reliant on Xi than the other way around.
Gideon, thank you very much indeed for bringing us your assessment, and of course we'll see what emerges after that formal agreement and what the way forward it will be. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, you're watching GB News Live. Coming up, higher. Yes, inflation 10.4%, food at 18.5%. It's taken all the experts by surprise. What will the Bank of England do tomorrow in terms of the interest rate rise? All the latest coming up with our business and economics editor. Stay with us.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain.
Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison? I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. The official inflation figures out this morning, back up to 10.4%, despite wider predictions that it could fall back to single figures. Just remind you, 10.1% the previous month. Well, the Chancellor's recent pledges to halve inflation this year may be now more difficult to achieve. The Office for National Statistics putting the latest increase down to higher prices in food, restaurant, hospitality industry and clothing too. And of course, we've got the Bank of England with the interest rate decision tomorrow, the base rate, under pressure perhaps now to push them higher again, even though that could cause problems for the banks and increasing the financial burdens on already squeezed households. Well, joining us now, our business and economics editor Liam Halligan with On the Money. And wait for it, and we get there.
Good things come to those who wait.
Including even higher inflation, unfortunately.
This is a surprise. I think it was widely predicted that inflation would fall into single digits this month, but that hasn't happened. Let's take a quick look at the numbers, Mark. We can see that in January, inflation was down to 10.1%. That was much lower than 11.1% in the late autumn. But then it went up again in February, that's the numbers that came out this morning, to 10.4%, which is a big disappointment. And as you say, a lot of that was driven by food, Mark. Food price inflation was up 18.2% in February 2023. So a standard basket of food was 18.2% more expensive in February this year than February last year. And that's the sharpest increase in food prices since 1977. But even those eye-watering numbers, a lot of people that go to the supermarket will say, actually, I think food prices have gone up even more. You know, milk's like 35% more expensive.
Yeah, well, skim milk, 42.2%.
Bread as well, because of grain prices and so on. And a lot of the reason we've got this rise in food prices is linked to, I'm afraid, the war in Ukraine, the impact on fertiliser prices, the price of crops that come out of Russia and Ukraine, getting them out through the Black Sea.
But we do also remember the hunt for a tomato or other bits of veg, of course, with the empty shelves. That pushed prices up. I mean, did it have a direct effect on this?
It did have a direct effect. I'd say at least part of this sharp spike in food prices, the highest since 1977, the Queen's Silver Jubilee, the late Queen's Silver Jubilee, when we were lads. At least part of the reason is because of high energy costs. You've had companies that grow fruit and veg in greenhouses. Their heating costs have been a lot more expensive. Their transport costs have been more expensive. But it's also domestic food too, as any farmer will tell you. Fertiliser prices remain really, really high. Fuel prices still remain a lot higher than before the war in Iraq. And all this feeds into food prices. And also something else, Mark, you know, since lockdown ended, we're trying to get to some kind of pre-lockdown normality. There is a sense that the economy is improving. Inflation we thought was coming down, but we've dodged recession. More people are going out to eat. More people are spending money on weekend breaks and so on. But the cost of all that has gone up a lot. not least because a lot of the restaurants and hotels have got huge debts that they
they're trying to cover,
as they got through COVID.
Well, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, very helpfully said falling inflation isn't inevitable, which isn't that encouraging. Of course, the government's saying we will halve inflation by the end of the year. Now, he also told the House of Lords Economics Committee that the priority of the Bank of England is to halve inflation. They're meeting tomorrow to decide on what happens with the base rate. And we were talking earlier this week, because of what's happened with the banks, that they may be under pressure to keep a hold because of what it's done to bank shares and so on.
That's right. Just before we get into the Bank of England, I think it's worth saying that inflation is likely to fall quite sharply next month, if you think about it, because it was in late February 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. It was in March that you had the real upward spike in fuel prices and food prices, the initial shock of that war. So in March a year on, March 2023, i.e. the numbers for next month when they come out, they're likely to be lower than that immediate post-war spike. So I do think inflation will come down. I do think this is a bit of a blip and a general downward trend in inflation. But as you say, the Bank of England now firmly across the horns of a dilemma, if you like. On the one hand, they want to be seen to be serious about bearing down on inflation, which would mean another sharp interest rate hike. On the other hand, it's not really high demand and spending that's causing this inflation. It's costs. And
the supply side, as they call it.
Cost push inflation, as we call it. Interest rate rises aren't going to affect that. And also, Mark, it strikes me that you have around the world, the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, even the Bank of China, they are now worried about the international banking system and the stability of that. So that may be a reason for the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve later today
I was going to say that
to keep rates on hold.
So will the Bank of England be looking at what happens in the States tonight? So,
look, the Federal Reserve is by far and away the most important central bank in the world. The dollar, the price of the dollar, which they effectively set by setting interest rates, is by far and away the most important economic variable in the world. And so the Bank of England, I would be amazed if it didn't do pretty much what the Fed does later today.
Thank you, as ever. And of course,
12 o'clock tomorrow, will be the Bank of England's decision.
Yeah, you'll hear it here first. Well, we'll try to get it first. And you'll be at the Bank of England.
I'll be at the Bank of England.
Excellent. Talking of big numbers, the takeover of Manchester United could be a step closer, but it might cost you £6 billion, even higher than inflation. That's coming up shortly. First, the headlines with Aaron.
Hi there, I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. It is 33 minutes past 1. Boris Johnson will very shortly give evidence to the Commons Privileges Committee, which is investigating whether he knowingly misled Parliament over Partygate. The panel of MPs published a new report this morning, which included photos of gatherings Mr Johnson attended and witness statements. One account from a Number 10 official says Johnson had the opportunity to shut down gatherings in Downing Street, but instead joined in. Mr Johnson maintains he didn't deliberately mislead MPs and relied on the advice of senior staff. The European Research Group of Eurosceptic Tory MPs is recommending its members vote against Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework aims to give the Stormont Assembly a greater say on how EU rules apply to the province. However, the Prime Minister could be facing a sizable Conservative rebellion when MPs vote on the Stormont break in about an hour's time. And that will include Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, who've said they'll vote against it. The Labour leader says crime's out of control and people are paying the price for a government that never takes responsibility. Speaking in the Commons, Sir Keir Starmer asked the Prime Minister if he accepted the findings of Baroness Casey's damning report in full. She found the Met Police to be institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. But Rishi Sunak says only the Conservatives can be trusted on policing.
What did his shadow policing minister say? Prison doesn't prevent crime. It tells you everything that you need to know about the Labour Party. You can't trust them to keep Britain safe.
Mr. Speaker, he needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and I don't mean to Malibu, to the streets of Britain. Go there and tell people it's all fine and see what reaction he gets.
25 people have been injured after a ship toppled over in a dry dock in Edinburgh. A major incident was declared this morning when the 3,000-tonne vessel became dislodged and keeled over at a 45-degree angle. 15 of those injured have been taken to hospital for further treatment. And surging food prices unexpectedly pushed inflation up last month, increasing fears of another hike in interest rates. The Office for National Statistics says it's the result of higher price growth in restaurants, clothing and food, which hit its highest rate in more than 45 years. And that was partly driven by a shortage of vegetables. The Bank of England will make their next interest rate decision tomorrow. TV, online, DAB+, radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Don't go anywhere. Mark will be back in just a few moments' time.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, the Thomas Cashman trials continued at Manchester Crown Court today. The 34-year-old denies the murder of Olivia Pratt-Corbell, as well as one count of attempted murder, one of wounding with intent and 2 counts of possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Well, our North West of England reporter Sophie Reaper has been at Manchester Crown Court for us. Sophie, what's the jury heard today?
Well, we're into day 13 of this Thomas Cashman trial now here at Manchester Crown Court. Yesterday, the defence opened their case, and that continued this morning with the defendant, Thomas Cashman, taking the stand in order to give evidence. Now, Mr Cooper of the defence began by asking Thomas Cashman about a comment made by a witness who can't be named for legal reasons, but who has suggested that Thomas Cashman has ruined her life. Now, in response to this, Mr Cashman told the court that, in fact, the opposite was true. He said, "She's ruined my life, she's ruined my partner's life, and she's ruined my kid's life." The defence then moved on to the timeline of events leading up to the shooting on the 22nd of August. They asked Mr Cashman about some CCTV footage in which we see him walking down a street, and at one point he looks up and makes an abrupt U-turn. Now, the prosecution alleges that this was Mr Cashman scoping out the area ahead of his plans to shoot Joseph Nee. Mr Cashman refutes this, saying that he was simply walking to his brother's house. Now, yesterday he told the court that he'd previously supplied some of his brother's friends with cannabis at his brother's house, but that his brother Kevin had disapproved of this, so the reason for this abrupt U-turn was because he'd seen his brother coming out the front of the property. Now, the defence has been going through this timeline step by step, and at each stage, Mr Cooper has asked Thomas Cashman if he'd been forming plans to shoot Joseph Nee, to which Mr Cashman has at each stage said no. Now, court's taken a brief break, but it's scheduled to resume again this afternoon.
Sophie, thank you very much for updating us at Manchester Crown Court. More, of course, as the proceedings return, as you say, this afternoon. Now, the potential takeover of Manchester United could be a step closer today. The owners setting a deadline for second bids by 9 tonight. Just to remind you, the Glazer family asking for, a paltry £6 billion. The current highest bidders who've gone public with their interest, Sheikh Yassim and British businessman and entrepreneur Sir Jim Ratcliffe. The Qataris apparently willing to pay the full price, putting them perhaps ahead of Sir Jim. But he's keen to make clear he will not pay over the odds, despite being a football supporter. Well, let's get the latest now with our sports broadcaster and football expert and football financial expert today, Aidan McGee. I'm just looking at the figures. I mean, they're eye-watering. Between 4.5 to 5 to 6 billion. And you also buy the debt with that, is that right?
Yeah, you do. You would have to, but you have to consider that although United is losing money, or it has done over the last couple of years, there were reasons for that. There are temporary liabilities. One was the COVID pandemic, of course. Fans are back in the stadium now, so they're able to recoup some of their losses from there. They look as if they're going to get back into the Champions League next year, which left a huge hole in their budget, their profit and loss sheet over the last year or so. And of course, Cristiano Ronaldo is no longer at the club. He was a heavy burden on their wage bill.
Yeah, but I guess you're not actually buying a club as such, are you? You're buying a brand with Manchester United, and it's all the things you sell across the globe.
Of course, it's something that will only come available every 20 years or so you need to act quickly. However, who's to say that the Glazers actually want to sell the whole thing? They might just want to do a different deal in terms of how they finance the club going forward. So, for example, you could get bidders on that group of 8 who just want to maybe buy a percentage for prestige purposes. They maybe want to come in and offer some financing, maybe redo Old Trafford or rebuild Old Trafford. That's going to cost about £1 billion if Tottenham's stadium is anything like a benchmark.
And that's where it starts getting complicated, because the indication is that Sir Jim Ratcliffe doesn't want to buy the whole kit and caboodle, and certainly not perhaps the debt as such. So one wonders, where that's going to take all these various bids, because they seem to be bidding for different things.
Yeah, they do. I mean, if you look at the Qatari bid, for example, Jim Ratcliffe is about success on the pitch. He's hoping that will chime well with the supporters.
And he's a fan himself.
He considers it a community asset. The Qataris want to mirror the bid that Manchester City were subject to back in 2008, and one that's involved the whole regeneration of East Manchester. It's involved regeneration of the stadium. They have a new training ground. It's not just about investment into players on the pitch. So that could take their investment up to about £7 billion. Wow. So that would satisfy what the Glazers want, but there's no indication yet that they want to actually sell the whole thing. They're looking at all bids, and as you say, all those bids are different.
How much will they be taking the fans' views into consideration? Because the Glazers have not been the most favourite owners of a football club. Let's reflect.
I don't think, when it comes to selling a club, I don't think that sellers really bother with who the club goes to, unless they're committed supporters and have been over the years, and they're going to be staying in the area. They're going to be visible for 5 years after the sale has taken place.
This is an international commodity.
They're in the States. They're based in the States, so they're not really going to care. The fan base haven't been particularly kind to them over the last 17 years, so I don't think it would particularly bother them. They want to go, yes, OK, you can say I want the club to go to the highest responsible bidder. I got in trouble once when I was at the News of the World for saying that an owner wanted to sell a club to the highest bidder. He phoned up and then said, no, I want to sell it to the highest responsible bidder. But that was a bidder who he was going to be in the picture for a while yet. He's going to be seen, he's going to be visible, he's going to be accountable to some degree. The Glazers won't be. They live in a different country. They live on the other side of the world.
Well, therefore, the question then poses the question about the Qataris, bearing in mind that the whole discussion of the political fallout from the World Cup and the human rights record and so on. I mean, will that have to be taken into consideration?
It'll be briefly taken into consideration, but let's see what the colour of their money is. The signs are they're going to bid very well. And if you ask most fans, yes, OK, they'll say they want the club run sustainably. United will probably run sustainably anyway because it generates so much money. But what they really want is investment in the team. They're fed up of their team lying behind Liverpool and Manchester City in recent years, and Chelsea, if you take it back over the last 10 years or so. Yeah. They want to see them back on top. There's 10 years since they won the Premier League title. There's going to be an immediate injection of cash. You've got that leeway to do that at Manchester United because they're not affected as much by FFP because the turnover is so high.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you what happens in terms of the financial league table, if you like, with Manchester City. Newcastle now, of course, with huge amounts going in. And, does that buy you success?
Yeah, of course it buys you success, but it's more difficult to do it now. You can't just load spending onto the club. Newcastle was actually in a decent position because Mike Ashley sold the club free of debt. Yeah. So you do have more leeway to spend. I think Newcastle has spent about £300 million since the Saudis went in there 18 months ago. So that's why you've seen them in a position to challenge for the Champions League. But as I say, Manchester United that's not really part of the conversation for United because it generates so much. And let's face it, financial fair play was devised to protect the big clubs, and that's exactly what it's doing at the moment.
Indeed. And the whistle being blown at 9 o'clock tonight, we think.
It is, but I don't think we'll see a sale until the end of the season. The bidders want it done by the start of the transfer window, but it's going to be down to the Glazers and the Rain Group. They created a market, and it'll be done on their terms.
Aidan, great stuff. Thank you very much for updating us here. And, of course, we'll see what emerges after 9 tonight. Now, let's reflect that the focus is back on Westminster today with not just that Partygate inquiry of Boris Johnson, but also the vote on the Northern Ireland Brexit deal, the Windsor framework. Well, the DUP's leader, Geoffrey Donaldson, Sir Geoffrey, confirming that his MPs will vote against that, the Windsor framework. Conservative MPs expected to do so as well, including two former Prime Ministers, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. That's expected at 2:30. Northern Ireland reporter Dougie Beattie joins us now. You switched to Stormont. You're heading across the political divide there in Northern Ireland to find out the latest one. What are they making about this, as we discussed last time, revelation from James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, that he's got this meeting with the EU on Friday and basically the deal will be done?
Well, that could knock Northern Ireland back decades, actually, because this building behind me, of course, Stormont, is a power-sharing executive. It was brought about by the Good Friday Agreement that agreed both sides would share power equally. And, of course, the unionists in Northern Ireland, well, they don't agree with the framework document. It's not just the DUP, it's the PUP, TUV, and even the very Liberal Unionist Party, which is a very small party, have not greeted it with any great fanfare. They've said that it's a stepping stone. So if unionists won't go in to share power in the building behind us, well then all you're left with is nationalism, the nationalist SDLP and Sinn Féin, a couple of small independents, and of course the Alliance Party, whose voting record is very much with nationalism here. So it won't put this back in place. So having this deal and then going and ratifying it with the EU on Friday will actually cause more problems inside Northern Ireland and make it even harder to get this place up and running behind us. And of course, the whole focus now is on Joe Biden's visit here because, of course, he wants to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement 25 years from it. But it will be ironic if he arrives here and there is no Good Friday Agreement there to be had. But there's also a lot of stuff coming out in this since the shine and the spin has gone off this agreement, the Windsor House framework document, or the Windsor document. Of course, is we're now finding out that the handbrake can only change certain rules and regulations, things like customs laws, etc. Northern Ireland are stuck on them anyhow, and they can't come back out of them. We've been hearing all morning about the price of food in the UK rising to 18%. Well, anywhere between 12 and 20% of the UK's food comes from Northern Ireland. And of course, if we get single farm payment, that could well be seen as state aid, which again would be challenged by the EU because it would put the Republic of Ireland at an unfair advantage. And the biggest one, we all talk about the small boats crisis. Well, there's a common travel area in the British Isles, and if Northern Ireland is held inside EU law and regulation, well, it will have to allow the free movement of people. So just get on a boat, come to Dublin, across a borderless island, and straight back into Britain without having a passport checked. So all these things have to really, really be looked at by Westminster when they're voting on this deal. And don't forget the ERG voted to have the protocol in the first place when this first started, when Boris had his oven-ready deal, and that actually caused the problems that we've got now.
OK, well, we've got the DUP indicating the 8 MPs at Westminster will be voting against this today, the Windsor Framework. But we reflect that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson earlier had been saying he appeared to indicate he did not believe the Windsor Framework needed to be renegotiated with the EU. So there's a little bit of you know, is it the fact that there are others within the DUP that are pushing him into a position to reject it, or is it that they believe they can just get the EU to move a little bit more?
No, I would know unionism very well, and unionists love devolution. They love the fact of having their own government. And in fact, the border poll, any sign of a border poll of 2011, 2013, it was down to about 30% because people loved that they had their own government. The problem being is here that he's got to sell it to hard-line unionists and walk the line with liberal unionists. But not everybody in Britain has to be the same British. So Scottish British is different from Welsh British and English British. Of course, and people, there is ways you can move around that. And what Sir Geoffrey is really looking at here is sort of a dual system where if you are manufacturing to go into the EU, well then do that and follow EU rules and regulations. And if you're manufacturing or producing agri-sector for the UK, then you go in there. This is all very doable. And the problem with it is, of course, that people don't have the will to do it because what they really want is the protection of the single market.
Yep.
You've got to remember Northern Ireland has about 70 billion a year in turnover, GDP, and of course 60 billion of that goes to the UK, not to the EU.
Dougie, thank you very much indeed. That vote, of course, in the Commons at 2:30. We'll update you on that. But let's just take you from Stormont to Edinburgh, in fact, to Imperial Dock in Leith for some extraordinary pictures, because that is a 250-foot ship or super yacht, once owned by the Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen, which is on its side in a dry dock being toppled by strong winds. Now, we're being told by emergency services that this research vessel, RV Petrel, used to find historic shipwrecks, blown from its holdings this morning, and it's resulted in some 25 people being injured. The latest that we've got is that 15 had to be taken to hospital, but 10 were treated at the scene. Members of the public still being asked to avoid the area to allow emergency services to get access, but clearly they're going to have to try and get this righted within the dry dock. But indications at the moment that no serious injuries. 4 are in Western General Hospital, 11 in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and as you say, 10 others discharged at the scene. NHS Lothian saying we're on standby to receive any further people, but basically urging people not to attend A&E at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh unless it's an emergency. Clearly they are still trying to cope with the aftermath of that. But we'll keep you updated on that, as we will, of course, with the ship of state, because we've got plenty going on in Westminster, including a certain Boris Johnson in front of the MPs. That's coming up for you shortly at 2 o'clock. Stay with us here on GB News Live.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live, slightly ahead of 2 o'clock, because coming up very shortly, the Boris Johnson show. Well, maybe that's a bit unkind. However, the former Prime Minister will be facing the Privileges Committee on those claims that he intentionally misled MPs over the lockdown gatherings. We'll have those proceedings live for you. The cameras in the Grimond Room, the committee room there, where the Privileges Committee will be meeting. Just to remind you, 7 MPs, 4 Tory, 2 Labour and 1 Scottish National Party MP. The committee basically will be questioning him on whether he deliberately misled Parliament, and therefore the sanction could well be, if it decides that that was in contempt of Parliament, suspension. If it's a lesser indication, a formal apology, but certainly it could bring into question his whole political future. Well, here in the studio to follow the proceedings with us, our political reporter Olivia Utley, because we've already had 55 pages from Boris Johnson, 110 pages from the committee, putting it all out. And the committee already having said it should have been obvious to the former Prime Minister that statements denying COVID rules have been broken were untrue.
Yes, so essentially the committee's argument that they're building is that even if Boris Johnson wasn't given explicit advice from his advisors that he was breaking the rules, he should have known he was breaking the rules because, look, you can see these parties, there are...
The bottles are in front of you.
Bottles in front of you, exactly. Well, Boris Johnson's comeback to that is that if it was so obvious that he was breaking the rules, then why, for example, was there an official photographer there? Why were there so many other people in the room? If it should have been obvious to him, shouldn't it have been obvious to them as well? He also argues, and this is why I think this afternoon is going to be full of fireworks, that the committee has gone further than its brief, that it's gone outside the scope of what it was supposed to do. So essentially he says that it was supposed to look into whether he lied about breaking the guidance, the regulations, sorry, and instead it's looked into whether he's misled the House on breaking guidance, which are 2 different things, because the guidance was that social distancing should be followed where possible, and Boris Johnson maintains that in number 10 Downing Street, a cramped townhouse...
A cramped townhouse is the phrase, Well, I don't know, it's quite big, isn't it? Yeah.
Quite big.
However,
social distancing wasn't possible.
I mean, it's moved a little bit from when we were discussing this originally, in that we've now got this phrase, knowingly or recklessly misleading Parliament. And he's got this KC, Lord Panic, on his side. It's not a judicial hearing, it's not a legal hearing, but he's obviously taken legal advice on what he should be putting in front of the committee. Why does that make a difference in terms of knowingly or recklessly taking this?
Lord Panic, Boris Johnson's legal advisor, is arguing that the committee has essentially lowered the bar. So they were supposed to be investigating whether Boris Johnson knowingly misled Parliament. Now, knowingly misled is exactly the same as lied, and lying is a swinging offence. Boris Johnson would lose his seat if he lied.
In contempt of Parliament.
In contempt of Parliament, exactly. But what the committee are now investigating, they've changed the wording, they've changed the scope of their remit, and they're now saying that they're investigating whether he knowingly or recklessly misled Parliament. Well, Boris Johnson and Lord Panic argue that recklessly has no precedent in these committee hearings. We don't know what happens if an MP recklessly misleads Parliament. That doesn't yet exist as a term. So Lord Panic is arguing, and it's a pretty bolshy argument this, that the entire inquiry is unlawful. Well, the committee argues, as you have just said there, that it's not a criminal case at all.
This is parliamentary procedure.
It's parliamentary procedure.
OK, and we've had Boris Johnson publishing his introduction where he's accepted, I misled Parliament. However, what he said was in good faith, indicating that he'd been briefed by his advisors and his communications chief. But we've now got, with 110 pages coming out from the committee, Jack Doyle, the communications chief, denying telling Boris Johnson. I think we can now go to the committee. I think Boris Johnson has just appeared. Let's bring the pictures in for you. This is the Grimond Room, and this is the committee about to start the official proceedings. As we said, we have 7 MPs, 4 Tory, 2 Labour and 1 SNP. Harriet Harman is in the chair, and we will be learning as to what the first questions will be, but clearly the questions will be directed to Boris Johnson, not to his KC. Lord Pannick is there just to advise him. And Olivia, just to indicate, as we were talking about Jack Doyle, the communications chief, denying telling Boris Johnson that the COVID-19 guidance, that phrase, had been followed at all times in number 10. But he said, I said I believed no rules were broken.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a bombshell for Boris Johnson this morning. It's not what he wants to hear. The Times have splashed on this story that, contrary to what Boris Johnson has said in his 52-page report, his advisers did not tell him categorically that it was safe to say that he hadn't broken the rules. Well, that makes things tricky. So what his advisers are now saying is that they told him to remove the phrase "all rules were followed" from the introduction to his statement to the House on the issue, and he did remove that phrase, implying that he did know that the rules had been broken.
Right.
But then later in the same debate, in answer to a question from a Labour MP, he used that phrase. He said, "No rules have been broken." Well, that's quite bad news, because if his advisers told him to remove the line that no rules had been broken, essentially it's suggesting that they have been broken.
That's
he
prior
agreed
knowledge.
to remove it,
Yeah.
so he did know it, and then he actually slipped it in later in the debate. That's not a great look.
So it's going beyond semantics. And in addition to that, we've got the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case saying he did not give Boris Johnson assurances that the guidance, again that word, had been adhered to at all times.
Well, exactly. Simon Case and Martin Reynolds as well. Dominic Cummings saying that Lee Kane, who was Boris Johnson's chief of communications at the time, Cummings says that Kane and Cummings both warned Boris Johnson about the problems with rule breaking. So this assertion from Boris Johnson that he was simply relaying what his advisors told him, their advice was wrong, but hey, it's not my fault.
Or that Boris Johnson saying that for obvious reason Cummings has animus. Well, here we are. We have Boris Johnson coming in with Lord Pannick, the KC, his legal advisor, even though, as we say, this is not a court of law. It is a parliamentary committee. Here we go.
Order, order. This is a public evidence session of the House of Commons Committee of Privileges. The Privileges Committee's purpose in this inquiry is to decide whether or not Mr Johnson misled the House of Commons, whether or not he committed a contempt of the House, and whether or not this was in any way intentional or reckless. This is what the House of Commons has required us to do by referring this matter to us in the motion which was carried without a vote against in April last year. Misleading the House might sound like a technical issue, but it is a matter of great importance. Our democracy is based on Parliament scrutinising legislation and holding the government to account for its actions. We proceed on the basis that what we are told by ministers is accurate. Parliament expects proactive candour and transparency. If what ministers tell us is not the truth, we can't do our job. Our democracy depends upon trust that what ministers tell MPs in the House of Commons is the truth. And without that trust, our entire parliamentary democracy is undermined. Everyone makes mistakes, and when ministers do, they're expected to correct it at the earliest opportunity, and that is what happens routinely. Inadvertent misleading, which is promptly corrected, is not an issue. The House understands if ministers decline to answer, for example, on matters which relate to national security or market sensitivity. But misleading intentionally or recklessly, or refusing to answer, or failing to correct, impedes or frustrates the functioning of the House and is contempt. During the COVID pandemic, the government and Parliament imposed extensive restrictions on our freedom in the interest of protecting public health. In this inquiry, we are not looking at the rights or wrongs of those COVID rules or guidance, or repeating the Partygate inquiry into the conduct of individual ministers and officials in number 10. What the House has mandated us to look at is whether Mr Johnson told the truth to Parliament to the best of his knowledge about number 10's compliance with those COVID rules and guidance. It is about the truth, and that is why this inquiry goes to the heart of the trust on which our system of accountability depends. This committee is comprised of members of Parliament who have been appointed to this role by the House of Commons. The political balance on this committee reflects the political balance in the House, which is why the committee comprises 4 Conservatives and 3 opposition MPs, including 2 from Labour and 1 from the SNP. Having said that, we leave our party interests at the door of the committee room and conduct our work in the interests of the House. That is what we're doing in this inquiry and what we will continue to do. We are examining what Mr Johnson said to the House about gatherings in number 10, whether what he said to the House was correct or not, whether, and if so, how quickly and comprehensively any misleading statement was corrected. If a statement was misleading, we will then consider whether that was a genuine error or if it was reckless or intentional, and whether the record was corrected in good time. We have already considered evidence supplied by the government, including emails, WhatsApp messages, and photos taken at the time, and written statements taken under oath from witnesses present at the relevant times, to inform us of what Mr Johnson would have known at the time of his statements to the House. There has been much comment about whether the committee is relying on the Sue Gray report material. We are not relying on any such material, and nor will we. Last November, we decided to collect direct, first-hand evidence from all the witnesses under oath, and this has all been disclosed to Mr Johnson. Sue Gray is not a witness. We have followed the standing orders of the House and the precedents as advised by our clerks, by Speaker's Counsel, and by Sir Ernest Ryder, a former Lord Justice of Appeal. We have not changed the rules or the procedure. That is not within our remit. They are laid down by the House, we are bound to follow them, and that is what we've done. In our report of the 3rd of March, we set out the main issues which we will be asking Mr Johnson about today. We'll be talking about rules and guidance, since Mr Johnson told the House number 10 complied with both. When we refer to rules, we mean regulations laid down by the House, which have the force of law, and under which fixed penalty notices were issued. Guidance is guidance issued by the government. For example, when Mr Johnson was talking about hands, face, space, he was referring to the guidance on social distancing when he said space. On the basis of information that is in the public domain and evidence the committee has received, and in the context of what Mr Johnson said to the House of Commons, we will be establishing what rules and guidance relating to COVID were in force at the relevant time, Mr Johnson's knowledge of those rules and guidance, Mr Johnson's attendance at or knowledge of gatherings that were not socially distanced and those for which fixed penalty notices were issued. Mr Johnson spoke about the question of COVID compliance in number 10 in the House of Commons more than 30 times, most particularly on the 1st of December 2021, the 8th of December 2021, and the 25th of May 2022. I'd like us all to have a reminder now of some of what Mr Johnson said in Parliament in answer to questions, starting, if we may, with a question from the Leader of the Opposition on the 1st of December.
As millions of people were locked down last year, was a Christmas party thrown in Downing Street for dozens of people on December the 18th?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during number 10. But I repeat, Mr. Speaker, that I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured. I apologise for the impression that has been given that staff in Downing Street take this less than seriously. I'm sickened myself and furious about that. But I repeat what I have said to him, that I have been repeatedly assured that the rules are not broken.
The Prime Minister has been caught red-handed. Why doesn't he end the investigation right now by just admitting it?
Because, Mr. Speaker, I've been repeatedly assured that no rules were broken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister tell the House whether there was a party in Downing Street on the 13th of November?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, but I'm sure that whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times. And I'm happy to set on the record now that when I came to this House and said in all sincerity that the rules and guidance had been followed at all times, it was what I believed to be true. It was certainly the case when I was present at gatherings to wish staff farewell, and the House will note that my attendance at these moments, brief as it was, has not been found to be outside the rules. But clearly this was not the case for some of those gatherings after I had left, and at other gatherings when I was not even in the building.
Thank you. We need to understand why Mr. Johnson said to Parliament that no rules or guidance were broken in number 10, when we have evidence that he knew what the rules and guidance were, and that he was present at gatherings where those rules and guidance were breached. We have yet to reach our conclusions in this inquiry, and we will not do so until we have heard and considered Mr. Johnson's evidence today. The evidence that we have already raises clear questions, and this is Mr. Johnson's opportunity to give us his answers. Will the clerk to the committee please administer the oath?
I'm just going to take the Bible and read out the terms of the oath.
Yes, I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give for this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Johnson, you provided the committee with a written submission which the committee has published. Do you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, please make your opening statement.
Thank you. Chair, if I can, before I begin, I'm conscious that we're all expected to vote in a few minutes, I think at 2:21. I hope you don't mind if I resume. I mean, it will break up what I'm about to say.
Well, we're a parliamentary committee and Parliament is continuing. If there is a vote called, which we do expect, I will suspend the sitting to enable members to vote, and we can pick up from where we left off. But thanks for reminding everybody that that's what's going to be happening.
Thank you, Chair. Well, as you've just said, there were a number of days over a period of 20 months when gatherings took place in Downing Street that went past the point where they could be said to be necessary for work purposes. That was wrong. I bitterly regret it. I understand public anger, and I continue to apologise for what happened on my watch, and I take full responsibility. But as you've just said, Chair, the purpose of this inquiry is not to reopen so-called Partygate. It is to discover whether or not I lied to Parliament, wittingly misled colleagues and the country about what I knew and believed about those gatherings when I said that the rules and the guidance had been followed at number 10. I am here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House. When those statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. When this inquiry was set up, I was completely confident that you would find nothing to show I knew or believed anything else, as indeed you have not. I was confident not because there's been some kind of cover-up. I was confident because I knew that is what I believed, and that is why I said it. To understand why I believed it, you have to go back to a time before the Sue Gray report, before the police investigation, back to a time where, as the evidence before the committee shows, there was a near universal belief at number 10 that the rules and guidance were being complied with. That is the general belief that has been uncovered by your evidence, and it was that belief that governed what I said in the House. And as soon as it was clear that I was wrong, and as soon as the Sue Gray investigation and the Metropolitan Police investigation had concluded, I came to the House of Commons and I corrected the record as I promised I would. I clearly could not have anticipated the outcome by coming earlier because I genuinely did not know what the outcome would be and was deeply shocked when fines were issued, not least since I had been told on a couple of occasions at least by Sue Gray that she did not think the threshold of criminality had been reached. I believe that the committee's work helps to explain why I was so shocked. You've been investigating this for more than 10 months, and I thank you for what you have done. You have had access to a vast body of evidence. You have collected and reviewed hundreds of pages of transcripts of Sue Gray's interviews, and you have analysed many thousands of contemporary emails and WhatsApp messages and other material. You found nothing to show that I was warned in advance that events in number 10 were illegal. In fact, nothing to show that anyone raised anxieties with me about any event, whether before or after it had taken place. If there had been such anxiety about a rule-breaking event at number 10, it would unquestionably have been escalated to me. We all knew how vital it was to maintain public confidence in the fight against COVID, that we should do what we were asking the public to do. There's only one exception, of course, and that's the testimony of Dominic Cummings, which is unsupported by any documentary evidence and which plainly cannot be relied upon. He has every motive to lie. Not only has the committee found nothing incriminating, it has gathered a huge amount of evidence which demonstrates very clearly that those working in number 10 shared my belief that the rules and the guidance were being followed, and that I received assurances that there was no rule breaking at number 10. The best and fairest course now would be for the committee to publish all the evidence it has assembled so that Parliament and public can judge for themselves. Despite my repeated requests, the committee has refused to do this. As investigator, prosecutor, judge and jury, it has elected only to publish the evidence which it considers incriminating and not the evidence which I rely on and which answers the charges. And despite assurances that we would be permitted to add material that we rely on into the core bundle published today, late last night we were told that the committee was not willing to publish a large number of extracts which I rely upon in my defence. That is manifestly unfair. Instead, and in the absence of any evidence that I deliberately misled Parliament, the committee is trying to mount an argument that I must have known that the guidance was not being followed, and that I buried in my head as we were fighting COVID was an unarticulated belief that even if we were following the rules, we were somehow failing to follow the guidance. And you have in your fourth report suggested that it must have been obvious to me because you have the photographs. So let me deal with this point head on, because it is nonsense. These photos have now been churned through the media for more than a year, and it seems to be the view of the committee and sadly many members of the public that they show me attending rule-breaking parties where no one was social distancing. They show nothing of the kind. They show me giving a few words of thanks at a work event for a departing colleague. They show me with my red box passing on the way to another meeting or heading back into my flat to carry on working often late into the night. They show a few people standing together as permitted by the guidance where full social distancing is not possible and where mitigating measures are taken. They show events which I was never fined for attending. I know the public will have had the impression that these were covert photos with their sinister pixelations that have been obtained by the media. The vast majority were in fact taken by the official number 10 photographer. To say that we would have held illicit events in number 10 while allowing these events to be immortalised by an official photographer is staggeringly implausible. There are a couple of photos where the event is captured on Zoom as well as by the official photographer, which only reinforces the point. If we had an event that we believed was illicit or unauthorised, why would we have it on Zoom when you never quite know who is on the other side? Most important of all, if it was obvious to me that these events were contrary to the guidance and the rules, then it must have been equally obvious to dozens of others, including the most senior officials in the country, all of them, like me, responsible for drawing up the rules. And it must have been obvious to others in the building, including the current Prime Minister.
Order, order. We will now suspend the sitting whilst the House of Commons votes, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
So, just to explain, that's the division bell that you've just heard. So the committee is in abeyance while they go to vote in the Windsor Protocol vote, which Boris Johnson's indicated he'll be voting against the government and the Prime Minister. So this will be some time, we guess, in terms of the vote going ahead through the various divisions. But just to remind you that Harriet Harman, the chair there, saying that they will reconvene once that vote has taken place. But we have heard Boris Johnson starting the explanation of his defence, and in particular he was just going through there the photographs, which is part of this bundle of 110 documents and pages that the committee released early this morning, indicating there that he said the official photographer of number 10 was taking those photos, saying that they were work events, and a few words he said at a work event, or taking my red box to the flat, a few people standing together, and this was allowed under the regulations. Olivia is still with us in the studio in terms of assessing what we're hearing, and it's quite an interesting point because, of course, we remember all the photos of the bottles and all the sort of sandwich and so on. And just to remind people, in terms of the regulations, you were allowed to have a work event if it was directly related to that. And this seems to be the line of defence here from Boris Johnson.
Yeah, so the line of defence is essentially that the committee's argument that it should have been obvious to him doesn't stand, because he says there is a near universal agreement from the people who were working in number 10 at the time that rules were being followed. And this point that he makes about, well, if it was so obvious, why on earth would there be an official number 10 photographer there? It'll be really interesting to see how Harriet Harman deals with that, because as we saw at the very beginning in her opening statements there, she was trying to preempt as many of Boris Johnson's arguments as she could. So he made the point in the dossier that he believed that the committee has gone beyond the scope of what it was supposed to do by investigating breaches of guidance as well as breaches of regulations. Well, she chose to play those clips from Prime Minister's questions in which Boris Johnson talks about sticking to the regulations and to the guidance. guidance, which kind of strikes a line through that particular bit of his
uncomfortable viewing for him.
Yes, forensic there from the chair as a beginning.
But interesting then that Boris Johnson came up with this aspect that there was more evidence that he was wanting, or at least his legal team was wanting to put in front of the committee, which basically bolstered his point of view, but that the committee did not allow that to be actually put forward.
Yeah, and I think we can expect to see quite a lot more of this. So that's what I meant when I suggested fireworks. That Boris Johnson accuses the committee there of being investigator, prosecutor, judge and jury, and that he believes that they are biased and there isn't enough oversight of what they're doing. So he says that lots of the evidence which he is now relying on wasn't allowed to be submitted. He submitted this 52-page dossier yesterday. His legal team wanted to add to that dossier, but they were told by the committee last night that they wouldn't be able to. Well, Boris Johnson says that's not fair, and I think we can expect a lot more of that as the committee
despite
goes on.
assurances, he said, so he indicating that he was assured maybe that this would be put forward. The committee not willing to publish evidence in my defence. Their argument is, I must have known, close quote. Just to explain, we've got the picture now of the Commons, the chamber where MPs are starting to filter in. I think that's Theresa May. We can just see maybe they're going through. And in terms of the vote then on the so-called Windsor framework, I mean, the additional spice to this, if you like, Olivia, is that we've got Boris Johnson having gone public to say he will not be voting for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the government on this, nor will Liz Truss, another former Prime Minister. Well, we normally have former Prime Ministers holding their own council.
Well, I know this is pretty spicy. So yesterday, the ERG wasn't even clear, the ERG being that sort of Spartan group of hardline, if you like, Brexiteers. They hadn't even quite made up their mind on whether they were going to vote in favour of the deal or not. And then yesterday evening, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss both came out and said that they wouldn't be supporting it. And then, sure enough, I was at the ERG press conference at 11:30 this morning, and the ERG was advising its members not to vote for the deal. So it seems as though Boris Johnson has swayed a few Brexit minds here.
Right.
And last week it sounded like Number 10 was sort of braced for a rebellion of up to 20. They now expect a rebellion of more like 34, which puts them in the territory of losing their majority. Of course, Labour is going to vote with them.
Yeah,
so
we should explain the government is likely to win this vote because Labour said they will vote with the government to get it through. But I'm just looking at what Steve Baker, who led the ERG at one stage, the head Spartan, if you like, indicating we will not be relying on opposition MPs to win this vote. So does he know something the rest of them don't, or is he just basically indicating that they should stay on the Prime Minister's side?
It does sound as though they would squeak it through even without opposition votes, but the rebellion is bigger than they were expecting.
Right.
I've heard that the Prime Minister was offering to slip MPs, that means let them off voting if he thought they might be considering voting against the bill, so trying to mitigate the damage essentially and convert no's into abstentions.
Yeah. OK, but just looking at the sort of politics, if you like, rather than the voting on the framework, the fact that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have gone public to say what they'll be doing, and then Steve Baker saying, or urging Boris Johnson not to risk becoming what he said was a pound shop Nigel Farage, with apologies to Nigel. But in terms of the political currency, if you like, is it sour grapes against Rishi Sunak, not actually to do with the Windsor framework?
Well, it could well be that there is an element of that. We know that relationships between the Prime Minister and Boris Johnson are pretty low, and we are seeing a few of the old characters who didn't like the idea of Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister in the first place. Some of Liz Truss's most fervent supporters, Simon Clarke, for example, very close supporter of Liz Truss, all coming out against the deal. Now, is it because they don't like the deal itself, or is it because it's a tribal thing and they're choosing to take sides with Boris Johnson? There is a bit of evidence for the latter in that as soon as the deal came out, it was pretty much unanimous.
It was, wasn't it? It was a thumbs up for many.
Even Geoffrey Donaldson, the leader of the DUP, didn't come out immediately and say that he would vote against the deal. Ian Paisley, a more hardline DUP MP, did. But it was the feeling towards the deal a couple of weeks ago was very, very positive. So the fact that it's deteriorated to this extent could suggest, with very little happening in between to change minds, that it has become a tribal thing.
Yeah, and we've got indications that Priti Patel now and also Sir Ian Duncan-Smith may vote against as well. But just to touch on Sir Geoffrey Donaldson and what will be happening with the DUP. I mean, all 8 DUP MPs indicating they will vote against. But we've got this interesting quote from Sir Geoffrey Donaldson just a couple of days ago, appearing to indicate he did not believe that the Windsor framework needed to be renegotiated with the EU. That's not exactly an out-of-hand rejection, is it?
Well, no, he's been actually... has made some quite warm sounds towards the deal, and I was in Belfast a couple of days after the deal was announced when just before the deal was announced, when Rishi Sunak was speaking to the DUP, and he said that considerable progress had been made. So it sounds as though the DUP's issues with the framework aren't too deep,
But he's got to try and keep his party together, because certainly in terms of Sammy Wilson and Ian Paisley within the party in Stormont, they're indicating, it doesn't cut the mustard, I think was the phrase that they'd used.
It doesn't cut the mustard was indeed the phrase that they used. And what the DUP is worried about is a split in the DUP vote.
Yeah.
So the issue is in Northern Ireland that Sinn Féin is now the largest party, and that is because the unionist vote has been split. So DUP supporters, quite nitty-gritty here, but DUP supporters are moving over to the TUV, the traditional unionist party, which is more hard-line than the DUP. So in order to keep its voters on side, the DUP feels that it's got to be pretty hard-line.
Seen to be hard-line, yeah. And you've got the EUP, of course, which is slightly softer on the whole issue. Yeah. But just to explain to people why this ties together, we were talking earlier about the ERG, the so-called Spartans. You were at their news conference earlier, and of course they had said pretty early on, we will do whatever the DUP decide, and we will back them up in terms of the whole issue of unionism. Now, you were at that news conference earlier. Why did they leave it until this morning to indicate that what they were going to ask their fellow ERG travellers to do? Because yesterday Mark Francis was saying, well, we're not going to tell you quite yet which way we're going to jump.
Yeah, well, it's not entirely clear. I think that there is a possibility that the reason is that Boris Johnson, the tribal, the politics angle of it, Boris Johnson, Priti Patel indicating that they're voting against, and the ERG has now come down on the same side as them. It could also be that within the DUP, up until a couple of days ago anyway, it sounded as though there were variations on feelings towards the deal. So there was a lot of scepticism generally, but whereas Ian Paisley and Sammy Wilson were dead against it, as you say, Geoffrey Donaldson perhaps wasn't, and that is backed up by, there was one poll out today suggesting that only 16% of unionists in Northern Ireland are actively opposed to the bill. So it could be that some of the DUP at least thought that they might be able to vote with the government on this.
I think we'll be going back to the committee fairly soon, which would indicate that those MPs on the committee and Boris Johnson himself have managed to vote. But last thought on this, of course, then we've got James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, indicating that he's off in London on Friday to meet Maros Sefcovic from the EU to actually formally adopt the Windsor Protocol to do the deal.
Well, exactly. So this vote is sort of a show, which is one of the reasons why the ERG and the DUP feel a bit antagonistic towards it. The DUP feels as though it has been treated very badly, partly because when the deal was being negotiated, Rishi Sunak was talking to the EU and not keeping the DUP on side all the way through. And now the handshaking meeting has already been planned before this indicative vote even goes through the House of Commons, which could as well add to the sense of dissatisfaction and could explain why this rebellion is bigger than was expected just a week ago.
And of course, then we obviously go to what happens at Stormont in terms of the DUP and power sharing, which is a whole other aspect. I don't know if we can actually bring the pictures back up now of the committee room. So we're going to go back there just to remind you that there is the committee room. I think Boris Johnson sat back down. I don't know if it's actually gone back into formal session. That will have to be declared by Harriet Harman, the chair there at the top of your picture with this horseshoe shape. But clearly the indications are that they have managed to vote. Let's have a listen in to see if we can hear anything. No, it is still getting everything ready in terms of the paperwork. But just to remind you, we had Boris Johnson going through the opening statement of his defence, addressing the issue of the photographs, which is part of the 110 pages that the committee has actually published. Of course, those bottles seen on the desk within number 10, and certainly Boris Johnson indicating that these were work events where he was expected to say a few words on staff leaving. And he was saying, Olivia, where he was also with his red box sort of walking through towards the flat in number 10, i.e. this was a workplace.
Yes, and I think what he's laying the groundwork for is essentially that saying that he was very, very busy as Prime Minister. He had lots of things on his plate. He couldn't be up to his eyes in exactly what the regulations were. That's why he was relying on the advice of his advisors. He makes the point in his 52-page dossier released yesterday that Prime Ministers should be able to rely on their advisors. Of course they should, and an advisor's word should be sort of law. Otherwise, a Prime Minister would get too bogged down in the details of running the number 10 operation to run the country. So I think that's why he keeps making all these references to working.
We're back to the committee.
I just made the point about the photographs, and I'd asked why on earth we would have held illicit or unauthorised gatherings in the presence of an official photographer. Then I went on to say, most important of all, if it was obvious to me that these events were contrary to the guidance and the rules, then it must have been equally obvious to dozens of others, including the most senior officials in the country, all of them, most of them like me, responsible for drawing up the rules, and it must have been obvious to others in the building, including the current Prime Minister. On the contrary, the overwhelming evidence which you have assembled is that these individuals believed that the rules and the guidance were being complied with. And what is so telling is the number of officials who say the same thing, and the total silence of the written or electronic record about concerns that anyone wanted to raise with me. It would be one thing if the committee had come here today and said, look, here are the emails or here are the WhatsApps that show that you were warned about rule breaking before you made your statements to the House. You haven't got any such evidence because that never happened. But if you now say instead that it must have been obvious that we were going against the rules and the guidance, then let's be clear about what you are saying. You're not only accusing me of lying, you're accusing all those civil servants, advisors, MPs, of lying about what they believed at the time to be going on. And as far as I know, you're not giving any of them the chance to explain themselves with their own oral evidence. I don't think you seriously mean to accuse those individuals of lying, and I don't think you can seriously mean to accuse me of lying. Now, everyone knows that there are some features of this proceeding that are extremely peculiar. I have the utmost respect for you, the Chair, but you've said some things about this matter before reading the evidence, which are plainly and wrongly prejudicial or prejudge the very issue on which you are adjudicating. I'm going to put your earlier remarks down to the general cut and thrust of politics and trust in what you have stressed at the outset, the impartiality that the committee insists upon and insists upon in your report. The committee is in fact supposed to be inquiring strictly into what I said about rule breaking rather than non-statutory guidance, so much of this interrogation is theoretically irrelevant, but I'm going to take that in my stride because I agree with what you said at the outset. It is your job, in which I want to help you to understand why I said what I said to Parliament and whether I deliberately set out to deceive. And I emphatically did not. Your first concern is that I may have knowingly or recklessly deceived Parliament on the 1st and 8th December when I said that the rules had not been broken and the guidance had been followed completely in number 10. When I said those words, I was not trying to cover up or conceal anything. I said what I said in good faith, based on what I honestly knew and reasonably believed at the time. That belief, what was in my head, was based on my understanding of the rules and the guidance. That did not mean that I believed that social distancing was complied with perfectly. That is because I and others in the building did not believe it was necessary or possible to have a 2 metre or 1 metre after June the 24th, 2020, electrified force field around every human being. Indeed, that is emphatically not what the guidance prescribes. It specifically says that social distancing should be maintained where possible, having regard to the work environment, and it is clear that in number 10 we had real difficulties in both working efficiently and at speed and in maintaining perfect social distancing. It's a cramped, narrow 18th century townhouse. We had no choice but to meet day in, day out, 7 days a week in an unrelenting battle against COVID. I had to call many meetings on the spot and to call make a great many high-speed decisions. Yes, we certainly did have social distancing. We avoided physical contact. We gave way to each other in the corridors and on the stairs. We gave each other as wide a berth as we could. But it would have been impossible to have a drill sergeant measuring the distance between us all hours of the day and night. So, as the guidance prescribes, we had mitigations. When I spoke about the guidance being followed, I was thinking of all the things we did to stop the spread of COVID, given where we were working. We had large numbers of people working from home. We had many meetings, at least partly on Zoom. We had limits on the numbers per room. We had sanitizer dispensers everywhere. We had signs on the walls telling you which way to walk. We kept windows open and we worked outside as much as possible. Because of the particular difficulties caused by the working environment, we had regular testing, and a whole testing system was set up, I believe, on the 3rd floor that went way beyond what was required in the guidance. So if you say, how could I stand up in Parliament and be so categorical about following the guidance? What was I thinking of? That is what I was thinking of. And I know you will, as you've just done, point to the photos and then to the guidance and what I said. And you will say it must have been obvious that the guidance was being breached. But that is simply not true. My beliefs and my remarks to Parliament were indeed based on my knowledge of those events. But you have to understand how I saw them and what I saw during the period I was there. The vast majority of the events relied upon by the committee are events I attended for 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps a maximum of 25 in one case, to say farewell to a departing colleague. I know that people around the country will look at those events and think they look like the very kind of events that we or I were forbidding to everyone else. But I will believe till the day I die that it was my job to thank staff for what they had done, especially during a crisis like COVID, which kept coming back, which seemed to have no end, and when people's morale did, I'm afraid, begin to sink. But never mind what I think, the more important point is that the police agreed. They did not find that my attendance at any of these farewell gatherings was against the rules. I obviously did not know at the time that any of these events later escalated beyond what was lawful after I left. There is, of course, one event for which I and the current Prime Minister received fixed penalty notices. But it never occurred to me, or I think the current Prime Minister at the time, that the event was not in compliance with the rules and the guidance. At about 2:22 p.m. on the 19th of June 2020, I went into the cabinet room where I worked after getting back from a long external visit. I stood at my desk briefly before another COVID meeting began and had a kind of salad. A number of officials came in to wish me a happy birthday. No one sang. The famous Union Jack cake remained in its Tupperware box, unnoticed by me, and was later discovered and eaten by my private secretaries. We talked, as you would expect, about COVID and what we were doing to beat the pandemic. It is a measure of how innocent we thought this meeting was that a slightly exaggerated version was briefed to the Times with singing and cake eating, and yet nothing untoward was apparently detected either by the reporter or by millions of eagle-eyed readers. So when I spoke to the Commons, it did not for 1 second on the 1st or the 8th of December, or at any time, it didn't for not 1 second occur to me that this event, the one event for which I was fined would later be found to be somehow against the rules. And the same goes for all the events I attended. My belief was that we were following the rules and the guidance to the best of our ability, given the circumstances, and that was what the guidance required. You may now say that I was being obtuse or oblivious and that we should have enforced social distancing more ruthlessly, and we can argue that back and forth. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. We're talking about what I believed at the time. As for the event of the 18th of December 2020 in the press room, I was not there, but my honest belief that it was within the rules was based on what I was told by senior advisors. The fact that this was my honest belief is supported by the fact that so many other people honestly believed that we were doing nothing wrong. And it's abundantly clear from the evidence produced by the committee that everyone was operating with the same understanding of the rules and the guidance. If you want further evidence of what was going on in my head, look at the WhatsApp to Jack Doyle, where I positively urge him to get the truth out to the public, the truth out about that December the 18th event. It seemed so unfair to me, based on what I had been told, that the event was being presented as a purely social gathering on what I knew to be a monumentally busy day for the media department, when they were coping both with the emergence that day of the Kent variant of COVID and what some saw as the risk of a no-deal Brexit. That was why I was inclined to believe that this event must be in line with the rules and the guidance. And that's why I said what I said on December the 1st. As for my statements on December the 8th, the committee is concerned that I may have misled the House when I said that I was repeatedly assured that the event was in accordance with the rules. I don't understand this point. You can see from the evidence that I received these assurances more than once and from more than one person. My statement was entirely accurate. The committee criticises the fact that I had not received assurances in relation to the guidance, but I never said that I had. I said what I said about the guidance based on my own experience and belief. The committee is critical of the fact that I did not receive assurances in respect of any event other than the December the 18th event. But I never said that I had. The committee seems at times to be saying in your fourth report that I should not be relying on the advice of political advisors or even officials. This is ridiculous. I was the Prime Minister of the UK. I was trying to run the country during a pandemic. On the evening in question, 30th of November 2021, I was dealing with the emergence of the Omicron variant and the growing clamour for restrictions on another Christmas. I could not drop what I was doing, get up and go and institute a personal investigation into what sounded like a Daily Mirror try-on about an event that was now almost a year old. I had to rely on, and was fully entitled to rely on, what I was told by my senior trusted advisors. Government would be paralysed if ministers were not able to do so. Finally, the committee criticises the manner in which I corrected the record. I corrected the record on the day of Sue Gray's final report and 6 days after the completion of the police investigation. If the committee's view is that I should have come to the House and provided an inevitably incomplete account while a government or a police investigation was going on, including into events I hadn't even attended, I fundamentally disagree. At all times, I was entirely transparent with the House. I made it clear that I did not intend to comment on any of the factual matters until the investigation had been concluded. I kept the House regularly updated, and as soon as the investigations were complete, I provided a full correction of my honest but inadvertently misleading statements. I apologise. I apologise for inadvertently misleading this House, but to say that I did it recklessly or deliberately is completely untrue, as the evidence shows. Whatever we got wrong, I believe that officials in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and indeed all Whitehall departments, should be immensely proud of their efforts to protect this country from a loathsome disease. When I point out to this committee that this disease almost killed me, it's only to stress how seriously I took the measures we needed to stop it spreading, as I believe everyone did in number 10, in Downing Street. It was those officials who organised and took the country through the lockdowns, which, whatever people may say about them now, were essential for public health. It was those officials who procured the vaccines that made sure this was the first country in the world to put an approved and effective vaccine in the arm of a patient. And it was those officials who helped mastermind the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe. It was thanks to those officials that we were able to come out of lockdown faster than any other European country, with all the social and economic benefits that entailed, and still to have a lower excess mortality rate than many other comparable countries. I am proud to have known and worked with those officials during one of the most difficult times we can remember. I am proud to have given them leadership, and that is what I believe I was doing at every one of the events in question. And I trust that the committee will be fair to them, fair to me, fair to the evidence about what we and I knew and believed, and conclude that I did not wittingly mislead the House of Commons or recklessly mislead the House of Commons, and that no contempt has been committed.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Before I turn to our questions, there's one issue that you raised, which your lawyers wrote to me about on Monday, and which I've replied to you this morning about. You raised the issue of the importance of the committee being fair to officials, and we would very much agree with you about that. And that is why we're not content with putting into evidence interview notes that officials gave to Sue Gray until such time as those officials had a chance to check those interview notes and to agree whether they're accurate, and then they can be supported by a statement of truth, which is like an oath, and then they can be put into evidence to us. If you would like to identify some officials and some aspects of the Sue Gray interview notes that you would like to then get under statements of truth and submit to this inquiry. The inquiry doesn't finish with this oral evidence session. You are perfectly at liberty to do that, and I would invite you to do that, and we can consider it.
Thank you. I will do that. There are about 16 points that we wish to elucidate, and it would be helpful to do that.
Okay, thank you. And we're putting now in the public domain your lawyer's letter to me and also my reply to you this morning, so that people can be clear about that. We'll now begin our questions, starting with those which cover the 6 gatherings that the committee thinks are the most relevant to our inquiry. When asked in the House of Commons about gatherings in number 10 from December 2021 onwards, you told the House that COVID rules and guidance were followed completely and at all times. Following the publication in May 2022 of the report which you'd commissioned into gatherings on government premises, you continued to maintain that it was certainly the case that the rules and guidance were followed at gatherings you had attended to wish farewell to staff who were leaving number 10. We will put to you what the COVID rules and guidance were on those 6 dates, what you knew about the gatherings that took place on each of those dates and their compliance with the rules and guidance then in force. We'll start by looking at 2 leaving gatherings that you attended in November 2020. We'll primarily be focusing on these gatherings' compliance with the COVID workplace guidance in place at the time. These gatherings took place during a national lockdown in England. The legal rules in force to prevent the spread of COVID included restrictions on indoor gatherings of 2 or more people. The workplace guidance in force at that time stated that there should be social distancing of 2 meters in the workplace wherever possible, and that only absolutely necessary participants should physically attend meetings. I will now invite Sir Bernard Jenkin to ask the first question. Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. So as the Chair described, we will first consider what knowledge you had of the rules and guidance in place at the time of each of the events you attended or of which you had knowledge, by reminding ourselves of what you were telling the country about the rules and guidance, and then we will ask about those gatherings. Now, you were aware of the importance of following the guidance the government had issued to keep workplaces safe. Indeed, you previously told the House of Commons on the 2nd of September 2020, and I quote, "It's very important that we get people back into the workplace in a COVID-secure way," unquote. And then on the 9th of November 2020, less than a week before the first of the gatherings that I will ask you about, you said at a COVID press conference, and I quote, "Neither mass testing nor progress on vaccines are at the present time a substitute for the national restrictions, for social distancing and all the rest. So it is all the more important to follow the rules," unquote. And at the press conferences over this period, you regularly repeated the phrase, hands, face, space, while standing at podiums bearing this phrase. So there can be no doubt that you understood what the guidance and rules meant and were intended to achieve. Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. On the 13th of November 2020, which we saw Catherine West just asking about on the film earlier, there was an impromptu leaving gathering for your then Director of Communications, Lee Kane. This was held in the vestibule outside the press office in number 10. Between 15 and 20 people were present and you gave a speech. And the evidence for this is at page 9 of the evidence bundle. Do you accept that these facts are correct?
Yes.
We will now show the pictures, which you have made your comments about, but nevertheless we will ask you about them. The unpixelated photos are on page 540 and 580 in the bundle of the total evidence pack. The pictures show you with at least 6 to 8 other people standing in close proximity. I want to ask first about this gathering's compliance with the guidance. You told the House of Commons as recently as the 25th of May 2022, which was the day of the publication of the Sucre report, that it was, and I quote, "certainly the case," strong words, that guidance had been followed at gatherings you attended to wish staff farewell, at least while you were there. At least while you were there. But the photographs show a lack of social distancing of 2 metres, which was required by the workplace guidance at the time.
It was 1 metre we were together.
So do you accept that you were present at this gathering and that people were not socially distanced while you were there?
Thank you very much, Sir Bernard. I don't accept that people were not making an effort to distance themselves socially from each other, and that happened the whole time in number 10. Actually, I think that the guidance by November 2020 stipulated that you should maintain 1 metre social distancing where possible, with mitigation where 2 metres is not viable. And at all stages, the guidance was intended to be implemented where possible, and that is absolutely clear from the guidance. As I said in my introduction, it was always the case that we understood that the confines of number 10 were going to make it impossible the whole time to enforce total social distancing, as it were, with an electric force field around every individual. Now, this meeting happened on an impromptu basis. It had to happen. It happened because on November the 13th, 2 senior members of and people will ask, why was this happening? Why was it necessary? It was necessary because 2 senior members of staff, the effective Chief of Staff and the Director of Communications, had both left the building or were about to leave the building in pretty acrimonious circumstances, or what were potentially acrimonious circumstances. It was important for me to be there and to give reassurance. And the salient point I would venture to make is that following that gathering, no fine was issued to me. My presence there was felt by the Met to be not to be unlawful. They agreed that it was a work-related event, and I believe it was absolutely essential for work purposes.
Right. Well, I'm asking about the guidance at the moment.
Yes, and I'm telling you that I believe the guidance so what you've got to understand, when I looked at that group, it did not for one second occur to me that we were in breach of the guidance given the logistical difficulties we faced in number 10 and the need to have urgent meetings such as this.
You said, you didn't quite answer my question to begin with, because you suggested that the picture doesn't show that people weren't making an effort to comply with the guidance. I'm just asking whether the evidence is that the guidance was being complied with, and I think by suggesting
I believe that the guidance is being complied with.
Right. Okay. Because I'll come to that. Because it must have occurred to you that, given that they weren't social distancing at 2 metres, that they might have been in breach of the social distancing guidance, either while you were at the gathering or indeed as you reflected on this afterwards, as the storm broke around your head. You must have been thinking, well, I wonder whether that was really complying with the guidance. That must have occurred.
So, Bernard, forgive me, but I've got to correct you on a point of a technical point. After June 24th, 2020, the guidance was changed so that the objective was to maintain social distancing at 1 metre with mitigations where 2 metres were not viable.
I'll come to that. But I think the first point is that it's fair to say that you didn't say that we did every effort to comply with the guidance of the House of Commons, and you didn't say that.
No, I'm saying that we followed the guidance completely, because you can't. Okay, right. We'll come to this in a minute. Okay. But you can't expect human beings in an environment like number 10 to have, as it were, a invisible electrified fence around them. They will occasionally drift into each other's orbit. When I saw that, it did not mean to me that we had breached the guidance. It meant that we were following the guidance to the best of our ability, which was what the guidance provided for. And the guidance provides for freedoms within the practical framework of the operation or the business to decide how you're going to implement the guidance. The measures that you referred to at the outset are things that need usually to be complied with. Businesses are entitled and asked to decide what practical considerations they wish to give to implementing the guidance, and that is what we did. Can I just say, so people understand why I believed, because this is the crucial thing, if I may say so, why I believed when I stood up on December the 1st that the guidance was followed completely at all times in number 10. What picture I had in my head, and why that doesn't conflict with that picture. The answer is that I knew from my direct personal experience that we were doing a huge amount to stop the spread of COVID within the building. We had sanitizers, we had windows were kept open, we had people working outdoors wherever they could, we had Zoom meetings, we had restrictions on the number of people in rooms, we had perspex screens between desks, and above all, as I said, we had testing, regular testing, which went way beyond what the guidance prescribed, and which, in my view, helped mitigate the difficulties we had in maintaining perfect social distancing.
Right. I'm bound to say that if you'd said all that at the time to the House of Commons, we probably wouldn't be sitting here. But you didn't. And the question is about what the guidance actually says. And I noticed you taking a little advice at that point on the question of the guidance. Can I just read to you, it's on page 6 of the bundle, what the guidance actually says. You must maintain social distancing in the workplace wherever possible. Where the social distancing guidelines cannot be followed in full in relation to a particular activity, the businesses should consider whether that activity be redesigned to maintain a 2 metre social distance, or 1 metre with risk mitigations where 2 metres is not viable. And the mitigating actions include using screens or barriers to separate people from each other. So where in the picture are there screens or barriers?
There were screens or barriers in the, I believe, in the adjacent press room from memory. Well, this is an impromptu gathering at which I'm thanking staff, at least one member of staff, for his contribution during COVID. I believe it was an important part of my job to do that. That was the best place to do it. I accept that perfect social distancing, Sir Bernard, is not being observed, but that does not mean that what we were doing, in my view, is incompatible with the guidance. The guidance specifically allows for workplace freedoms to decide how to implement it, and the operative conditional is where possible. Now, do not for one moment believe that people in number 10 did not operate social distancing, because they did. And they took great effort. They made great efforts, in my view, and to my memory, to stay apart from each other. But that didn't mean that they were able to stay apart from each other the whole time. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
that did not conflict with the guidance.
Nobody is devaluing the efforts of anybody in number 10 during the COVID, including you, by the way, and the public service you gave during your period as Prime Minister during the pandemic. All we're asking is to, I'm afraid, it's our obligation.
I'm trying to explain to you why I said that the guidance was followed.
I'm halfway through a question. All I'm saying is that we've got to find out, establish in our minds, whether what you told the House of Commons was strictly accurate. And the guidance goes on to say, where social distancing guidelines cannot be followed in full, even through redesigning a particular activity, businesses should consider whether that activity needs to continue for the business to operate. And if so, take all the mitigating actions possible to reduce the effect, the risk of transmission between the staff. Now, nobody is disputing that it's the right thing for you to thank your staff. The question is whether what you said about this particular way of thanking your staff in the House of Commons was strictly accurate. And indeed may have been misleading. That's what we're asking.
Well, I don't believe for a second that it was.
The guidance does not say you can have a thank you party and as many people in the room as you like. If you think it's very important to thank people, the guidance doesn't say that.
Let's just go back over that. I believed that this event was not only reasonably necessary, but it was essential for work purposes for the reasons that I have given. I've described the constraints in which we were operating in number 10. If you wanted to have a rapid gathering to thank people, this was the place to do it. There aren't, in fact, that many people there. I accept, though the pixelation makes it difficult to work out exactly who is where. I accept that perfect social distancing
got the unpixelated photographs.
Is
You've
not
got the
sure,
unpixelated.
Sure, but the public can't see that.
Yeah.
The public can't see that.
Yes, but that's
Bernard, I accept that not everybody is perfectly socially distanced in that picture, but that did not mean to me, when I stood up in the House of Commons and said that the guidance was followed completely, I was not thinking of that event and thinking that somehow that contravened the guidance. Absolutely not. Okay. We were making a huge effort to follow the guidance. That was my memory, and that is why I said what I said.
This is exactly the purpose of this session, that you can make the case that you're making. Can we move on to examine the compliance with the COVID rules at this gathering? As we heard in the clips earlier, you told the House the rules were followed at all times, so you must have thought the gathering was reasonably necessary for work purposes, as was then required by the regulations. We know that the gathering attracted fixed penalty notices. So in fact, the police have judged that it broke the rules. Why did you think it was within the rules?
I thought it was essential for work purposes, or at least reasonably necessary for work purposes, because for the reason I've given, Sir Bernard, that November the 13th was a day in which two senior officials, senior advisors in government, had left their jobs in very, very difficult and challenging circumstances. And it was necessary to steady the ship. It was necessary to show that there was no rancour, that the business of the government was being carried on. That's what we had to do. That's what I had to do.
I know that, but it's what you said about it to the House of Commons is what matters. We know it was a leaving event for a member of staff. The photographs we've just seen do not seem to show any actual work being done. Why did it not occur to you that it at least might have been in breach of the regulations, or at least because it was not reasonably necessary for work purposes?
Did you say, did it occur to me that it might not be reasonably necessary for work purposes?
Yes.
No, it didn't occur to me for 1 second that it wasn't reasonably necessary for work purposes.
In that particular way, and then say that particular thing about the way that event was actually carried on.
And I really, to this day, and as I said earlier on, I struggle to see how I could have run Number 10, run hundreds of officials who needed to be thanked and appreciated for their work in very trying circumstances without having brief farewell events of a kind that, at least insofar as my participation was concerned, did not fall foul of the rules. I just remind you of that key point about that event. I was not. I was there for a maximum of 20 minutes or 25 minutes, I think. I gave a short speech.
Could I cut in at
what
this
I did
point?
was not found to have been in
Mr.
breach of the
Johnson,
rules.
could I cut in at this point? Because how long you were at the gathering is not a question
No, I understand
that Mr.
that.
Jacob,
I understand
that
that,
Sir
Chair.
Bernard is asking you. And while I'm interjecting, you raised the question of imperfect social distancing. Social distancing, hands, face, space, which is the space part, is either 2 metres at this time, or it's 1 metre with mitigations.
2 metres
and
where
Sir Bernard,
possible.
2 metres.
2 metres where possible.
2 metres or 1 metre with mitigations, which is screens.
It doesn't say 1 metre where possible.
So
It doesn't say that.
The objective of social distancing is to maintain social distancing wherever possible. That's
so
what it says.
what is the notion of a less than perfect, an imperfect social distancing? Because you were telling the country to do social distancing.
Yes, but so did we in Number 10. And but I'm sure, by the way, that up and down the country, in spite of people's observance of social distancing, there were times when people drifted within 1 or 2 metres of each other. That is, I'm afraid, just inevitable. And we had a particular problem in Number 10 because, as I said earlier on, we had to call meetings at great speed. We had large numbers of staff that had to come into the building because we needed to get a variety of opinions, even though we had loads and loads of people also on Zoom. And it was not, we had as you know, because you've been to look at it, we had lots of higgledy-piggledy corridors where it wasn't, and spaces where it wasn't always easy to maintain perfect social distancing. That did not mean to, like that space there, that did not mean to me that
about higgledy-piggledy corridors. If you could just refer yourself to Sir Bernard's next question, which is about an event.
There were lots of people leading critical organisations around the country, and a leaving do for everyone else around the country was not acceptable under the guidelines, all the rules. So why was it acceptable and necessary for work purposes in Number 10?
Thank you, Sir Bernard. Well, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. I understand that people looking at that photograph will think that it looks like a social event. It was not a social event. If anybody thinks that I was partying during lockdown, they're completely wrong. That was not a party. I was there to.
I haven't said it was a party, Mr. Johnson.
Well, you did actually earlier on. What I was doing was thanking staff, or thanking one individual in particular, for their contribution, and I believe that was my job.
So, if you'd been asked at a press conference with your podium saying hands, face, space, whether it was okay for organisations to hold unsocially distanced farewell gatherings in the workplace, what would you have said?
I would have said that it's up to organisations, as the guidance says, to decide how and they are going to implement the guidance, amongst which is, of course, social distancing. Where they can't do social distancing perfectly, they can't maintain 2 metres or 1 metre, then they're entitled to have mitigations. And that's what the guidance says. And we did indeed have plenty of mitigations, including, and as I've said to you before, this was exceptional in Number 10. We had a great deal of testing.
So the answer is you would have said it was okay?
No, I said the answer is that you should do what the guidance says. And the guidance says that where you put in mitigations, where you do what is possible, and where you follow social distancing in a way that reflects the realities of your workspace, that will be in compliance with the guidance. That was my view, and I think that's what everybody else understood. Certainly that, and just can I repeat this point? This is what everybody understood, I believe, in number 10. It's for a long period of 20 months of the struggle against COVID, during which we were having, as the Prime Minister himself has said, describing the experience of walking into loads of rooms and finding lots of people there. It was simply part of working in number 10 that we were going to come into contact with a great number of people. But people did follow social distancing, and they were acutely conscious of it.
I now turn to the 27th of November 2020. This was another unplanned leaving gathering for a different special advisor that again took place in the vestibule outside the press office in number 10. And we have 3 witness statements attesting to a lack of social distancing at this event. We've got, and this is on page 17 of your witness bundle, we've got Jack Doyle, who was your press secretary at the time and subsequently your director of communications, saying that there were certainly more than 20 people in attendance. And do you accept that?
I don't know. I wasn't at that event, and it wasn't an event that was found to have been in breach of the rules.
There's no reason to dispute it.
Well, I happen to know because we've all seen the same evidence bundle. Though I think this is one of the things that you have that we haven't been allowed to point to. I think there is evidence from at least one of the participants that there weren't that many people there, and it lasted a very short time.
Well, by all means, make sure that's drawn to our attention.
Oh, sorry. This is the Clio event. Sorry.
Sorry, you mustn't mention any names.
I think that name we can mention. That event. My memory of that event. Forgive me, I was at that event, but I was there very briefly.
I was going to correct you.
Thank you. So I was at that event, but I was there very briefly. No fines were issued for that event.
Order. I'm afraid we have to suspend the committee again. There's a division in the Commons. We'll return in 15 minutes.
OK, ladies and gentlemen, yes, it's me, Patrick Christie's with you now. Mark Longhurst has done his stint. What you have been watching and listening to there is, of course, Boris Johnson giving evidence to the Privileged Committee in relation to whether or not he essentially misled knowingly Parliament or recklessly over these alleged lockdown parties. And he issued a strong opening statement there earlier on and was pretty robust in his defence. And he said that he, hand on heart, did not lie. He swore on a copy of the Bible. I don't know if anybody else